Imagine checking your email one ordinary evening. You are sitting at your desk, winding down after a long day of work, and you decide to open up your spam folder. For most of us, this folder is just a collection of junk mail and weird advertisements. But in March of 2019, a 25-year-old man named Joe Albanese checked his spam folder, and what he found would completely shatter his sense of safety. Joe lived with his parents, was paying off student loans, and kept a low profile, but as he scrolled, one email caught his eye. The title was his exact master password, which he used for almost all of his accounts. Seeing your password in an email subject line is enough to make anyone freeze. Joe opened it immediately, his heart racing. The message inside was direct and cold. The sender claimed to have hacked into Joe's accounts and demanded $5,000 in Bitcoin. The hacker tried to make it sound polite, calling it a donation for a good cause rather than blackmail, and warned Joe not to go to the police because the email was untraceable. At first, Joe figured this was a common automated scam. He decided to test the sender, replying to ask what other personal info they possessed. But he was wrong. He promptly received a response back. The hacker wrote that they knew his home address, and then they typed out the exact address of his parents' house. The message ended with a warning that if Joe went to the police, they would know about it and Joe would be very sorry. This was when real worry set in. Joe did not reply for several days, deciding to wait it out. But 3 days later, a follow-up email arrived, stating they would not wait much longer. At this point, Joe got angry and decided to bluff. He replied to the email, stating that he was not paying $5,000, and warned the hacker that if they dared to come to his house, they would get a face full of lead. This was a complete bluff, as Joe did not own a gun, but the hacker was not scared. That same night, Joe received a terrifying photograph. When he opened the image, his blood ran cold. It was a picture of his parents' house. The photo had been taken from the darkness of the yard, zoomed in directly on Joe's second-story bedroom window. The hacker had been standing right outside in the dark, looking up at his window. Joe realized his bluff had failed. He knew he had to act, but he was still terrified of worrying his parents. He replied one last time, pleading with the stalker. He explained that he was broke, drowning in student loans, and that the house belonged to his parents, who had done nothing wrong. He asked them to target someone else. There was no email response this time. Instead, the response came in a physical, violent way. Within an hour of sending that final email, a loud crash echoed through the bottom floor of the house. The sound of glass shattering echoed up the stairs. Joe and his parents rushed downstairs to the dining room. There, lying among the broken glass, was a brick from their garden. Someone had stood in their yard, picked up the brick, and hurled it through their window. Joe quickly explained the entire threatening situation to his terrified parents. While his dad grabbed a flashlight to search the dark yard, his mother called the police. An officer arrived and stayed parked outside the house for a couple of hours that night, but the attacker was already gone. Joe blocked the email address, and luckily the harassment stopped. When the police investigated, they found the emails had been routed through an untraceable device, likely an older iPod Touch, leaving no digital footprint. Joe survived the ordeal, but his sense of security in his own home was shattered forever. But Joe's experience, as terrifying as it was, lasted only a few days. For some people, digital harassment becomes a slow, agonizing experience that lasts for years. This was the case for an ex-radio host and disc jockey based in Los Angeles. In the entertainment industry, having an online presence is a necessity. You want to connect with your listeners and share your schedule. But being in the spotlight also attracts people who lose their grip on reality. Around 2005 or 2006, the disc jockey began to notice a very frequent listener. She would call into his radio show on the request line almost every single day. She seemed friendly, just a passionate fan. Eventually, this listener won a prize, and the disc jockey requested her email address. This was a completely routine transaction. But to this fan, receiving a direct line of communication was like an invitation into his personal life. As social media platforms like Facebook began to grow, the disc jockey accepted her friend request to remain polite. She immediately became incredibly active on his page, liking and commenting on every single photo and shared link. The disc jockey did his best to keep his distance, but things took a sharp turn when the fan sent him an email professing her deep, romantic love for him. The disc jockey knew he had to set a firm boundary. He wrote back, rejecting her advances in the most polite, professional way possible. The fans seemed to accept the rejection at first, and the disc jockey breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the awkward situation was handled, but it was only the beginning of a decade-long nightmare. By 2011, the fans' obsession had morphed into a full-blown delusion. She sent the disc jockey a link to a blog she had created. He clicked the link and was horrified by what he saw. The blog was entirely dedicated to him, filled with multiple posts every single day, writing detailed stories about their imaginary relationship and their supposed deep love for one another. Even worse, she began to find secret, coded meanings in the songs he played during his radio broadcasts. Whenever he played the song "Marry Me" by Train, she claimed it was a proposal. As the months went on, her posts became darker. She began saving photos of other women from the disc jockey's personal social media, including his actual girlfriends and casual female friends. She posted these photos on her blog, accompanied by incredibly hostile, hateful, and angry rants. But her behavior was completely unpredictable. 10 minutes after posting a furious, insulting tirade calling him terrible names, she would upload a soft, tearful apology, begging for his forgiveness. The disc jockey tried to ignore the blogs, but the constant monitoring of his life was incredibly creepy. When she began emailing him directly again, he wrote back very forcefully, demanding that she stop. When she refused, he filed copyright takedown requests. The host shut her blog down, but this only made things worse. With her blog gone, she redirected all of her obsessive energy directly into his email inbox. Over the next several years, the disc jockey completely cut off all contact. He never replied to a single message, but she did not care. She continued to email him day after day, week after week. In total, she sent him over 4,000 emails, which the disc jockey carefully archived as evidence. The tone of her recent emails turned incredibly violent. She began threatening to track him down and physically hurt him, stating she would gladly go to prison just to have the chance to touch him. She even listed the specific neighborhood where he lived, proving she had been researching his location. In a desperate bid to protect his privacy, the disc jockey deleted all of his personal social media accounts. But the stalker still found ways to reach him. She would find photos of him posted on his friends' public accounts or official promotional images from the radio station and email them back to him. The most disturbing moment came when she sent him photos of a shrine she had built in her own home. The walls and desks of her room were covered in framed, printed pictures of the disc jockey, surrounded by personal items. Because of his profession, his public schedule remained public, meaning his stalker knew exactly where he would be working on any given weekend, leaving him in constant fear for his safety. Sometimes the digital threat does not come from a long-term stalker, but from a sudden predator waiting in the shadows. This is what Christian discovered during a terrifying afternoon involving his close friend Katie. They had previously worked together and maintained a close friendship. One afternoon, Katie had an important job interview. Christian planned to get in touch with her right after to see how things went. But when Christian sent her a text, he noticed it did not say delivered. He tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. He figured her phone was off during the interview. As the hours passed, Christian started to feel a growing sense of concern. Finally, after several hours, his text messages suddenly marked as delivered, but Katie still did not reply. Later that same afternoon, Christian noticed a strange email in his inbox from Katie's old work email address. It explained that she had lost both her phone and her keys. The writer asked Christian to come pick her up at an old industrial warehouse parking lot located directly across the street from a local Hyatt Place hotel. Christian was concerned, but he wanted more details. He replied, asking her where she had last seen her phone and how she had lost her keys. The reply came back quickly. The person writing as Katie claimed they had no idea how it happened and begged him to come quickly because it was getting very cold outside. They included the exact address of the parking lot. Christian looked up the address and saw it was about 20 minutes away. But when he switched the map to satellite view, he felt a cold chill. The address led to a completely abandoned, decaying warehouse parking lot with weeds growing through the cracked asphalt and a collapsed roof. Suspicious, Christian emailed back, urging her to walk across the street to the warm hotel lobby. A A few minutes later, another reply arrived. The sender claimed they were already sitting on a bench in the parking lot and felt comfortable, urging him to just hurry up. Christian got into his car and began driving toward the address. But as he drove, a realization hit him. How was Katie emailing him in the middle of a deserted parking lot? If she lost her phone, she would have to use her laptop. But how could her laptop connect to the internet there? The pieces of the story did not fit together. Christian pulled his car over and tried calling Katie's phone number again. To his surprise, it began to ring. On his third attempt, someone actually picked up. The line was silent for just a second before the call was abruptly ended. Christian knew something was wrong. He decided to call Katie's brother, who revealed that Katie had been safely at home for the last 2 hours. But there was a major catch. While she was out, someone had stolen her entire backpack, which contained her keys, her laptop, and her phone. Christian realized someone was actively using her stolen laptop to lure him to that deserted parking lot. He drove straight to Katie's house, and together they called the police to report the trap. The police dispatched a patrol car to investigate the abandoned warehouse parking lot, but the dark lot was completely empty. The predator had realized the trap had failed and vanished into the night. Katie's phone and laptop were never turned on again. She never got any of her personal stuff back, but at least they were both safe. But Christian's quick thinking saved him from walking directly into a dangerous ambush. These 3 real-life cases serve as a chilling reminder of how quickly the digital world can bleed into our physical reality. The screens we carry in our pockets can easily become windows for predators to watch us, track us, and lure us into the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. It was a cool Thursday evening in Sydney, Australia, and a 15-year-old boy found himself completely alone in his family home. His parents were out for the night, leaving him to look after the house and their loyal family dog. It started out as a completely normal, quiet night. He was just hanging out, relaxing, and doing what any teenager would do when they have the entire house to themselves. At around 9 p.m., he decided to head to the bathroom to get ready for bed. But as he stepped out of the bathroom and back into the hallway, the quietness of the night was instantly shattered. He heard the heavy metal front gate swing open with a loud, metallic creak. Immediately after, his dog began barking frantically at the front door. The boy paused in the middle of the hallway, his heart rate starting to pick up. Through the glass window across the hall that looked out onto the front porch, he saw a sudden blur of motion. Someone was running incredibly fast, moving right past the porch window and straight into the dark backyard. Even though it happened in a split second, the boy got a decent look at the stranger. The figure was hunched over, moving with a strange, sickly, and unnatural posture. He had very pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and he was wearing all black clothing. His hair was long, messy, and dark, partially draping over his face. He looked incredibly disheveled and completely out of place in this quiet neighborhood. The boy walked into the living room to try and get a better look at what was happening. His dog was still standing at the front door, growling low in its throat, its posture completely stiff and alert. The boy realized that since he had not seen the pale man run back toward the street, the intruder had to still be lurking somewhere in the dark backyard. He stood near the door, trying to figure out what his next move should be. That was when another man walked onto the front porch. This second man looked much more ordinary. He did not have the sickly, disheveled look of the first guy. He walked right up to the front door, which had heavy security bars installed on the outside. The boy cautiously approached the barred door, keeping his distance. The stranger looked at him through the metal bars and asked if he had seen his friend. The boy, trying to be helpful but remaining extremely cautious, replied that he thought the guy had run into his backyard. The man on the porch nodded and said that made sense, because he had been following this random guy all over the place. He added that he thought the guy was on drugs and might be dangerous to have around. But as soon as those words left the man's mouth, the boy felt a sudden wave of confusion. Something about this story did not add up at all. First, the man had referred to the intruder as his friend, but in the very next breath, he called him a random guy that he was just following around. The contradiction was jarring, But before the boy could even process what was happening, the second man quickly turned and walked off the porch, heading straight into the dark side yard toward the back of the house. The boy knew that there was a back door, but, like the front door, it was heavily secured with metal bars and was locked tight. He waited in the living room, his mind racing with terrible scenarios. About 2 minutes passed in complete silence. Then the normal-looking man walked back onto the front porch, only this time he was not alone. Standing right next to him was the sickly, pale man. The pale man was pacing back and forth on the wooden porch in a highly agitated, nervous state. The boy stepped closer to the door to see what they wanted from him. The normal-looking man looked through the security bars and apologized. He explained that he had just found his friend. He said that his friend was really nervous and would feel a lot better if the boy unlocked the door and stepped outside, just so his friend could see that the boy was harmless. The moment those words were spoken, the boy felt a sharp, icy pang of fear in his chest. As the man spoke, the pale, agitated guy suddenly stopped pacing. He stood completely still, in a very unnatural, frozen posture, and stared directly into the boy's eyes through the security bars. The silence between them was suffocating and heavy. The boy did not say a single word. Instead, he took a slow step forward and reached for the heavy wooden French doors behind the security bars, intending to shut them and cut off their line of sight. As soon as the boy made a move to close the doors, the second man's friendly, helpful demeanor completely vanished. He lunged forward, thrusting his arm through the security bars in a desperate, violent attempt to grab the boy or stop him from closing the door. The boy jumped back in pure terror. Using his foot, he slammed the heavy wooden door shut with all his strength and quickly threw the deadbolt. His hands were shaking violently as he grabbed his phone to call his parents. His parents immediately contacted the police. By the time the police arrived at the suburban Sydney home, the two men were long gone. The officers searched the yard and the surrounding streets but found no trace of them. However, the police did share a chilling piece of information with the family. They told the boy that less than an hour earlier, there had been a violent home invasion and break-in just a few doors down the street. Looking back on that terrifying night, the boy realized something disturbing. The pale man had run into the backyard to find an unlocked entry point. When he could not find one, the second man stepped in to try and trick the 15-year-old into opening the front door. They were not deterred by the fact that someone was home. They actively wanted him to come outside, or they wanted to get inside with him. The mystery of who those two men were, and what they would have done if the door had been opened, remains unsolved. We transition to another chilling encounter that took place on a quiet Thursday night, this time in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of night where you expect absolutely nothing out of the ordinary to happen. A young man was home alone. His mother was working a late shift as a nurse at the local hospital, and his two older brothers were away at college. For the evening, he had the entire place to himself. To pass the time, he had invited a few of his friends over to watch a baseball game. They hung out in the living room, had a few beers, and laughed. Around midnight, the game ended, and his friends decided it was time to head home. They said their goodbyes and left through the back door of the house. The young man walked up to the kitchen, carrying the remaining beers to put them back in the fridge. He was tired and looking forward to getting some sleep. He cleaned up a bit, headed to his bedroom upstairs and climbed into bed. But in his tired state, he made one critical mistake. He forgot to lock the back door after his friends left. He lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take over. The house was completely silent. But then, he heard the faint, distinct sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. He checked the time. It was late, but he knew his mother often got off her hospital shifts around this hour. As the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, he heard a soft, dry cough pass by his bedroom door. The footsteps continued down the hallway and into the bathroom. The young man relaxed, thinking his mother was finally home. After a minute, he heard the footsteps head back downstairs. But instead of going to bed, whoever was downstairs started making an incredible amount of noise in the kitchen. He could hear cabinet doors slamming open and shut, dishes clattering, and silverware scraping. It sounded like someone was frantically searching through the kitchen. He was far too comfortable and lazy to get out of bed, walk downstairs, and tell his mother to be quiet. Instead, he grabbed his phone off his desk and sent her a quick text message, asking her to please stop making so much noise because he was trying to sleep. He put his phone down on his desk and rolled over onto his side. Almost immediately, the noisy racket in the kitchen stopped. Then he heard footsteps coming back up the stairs. Only this time they were moving much faster. The footsteps approached his bedroom door, and the door swung open. The hallway light was turned off, so the room was cast in deep shadows. The young man could not see the person's face, but he could clearly make out a dark figure standing in his doorway. The figure was slouched over, completely motionless. Annoyed by the disruption, the young man spoke up. He told his mother to stop making so much damn noise. The figure did not respond. It just stood there, silently staring into the dark room. The silence felt heavy and strange. The young man sat up in his bed, feeling a sudden chill run down his spine. He called out again, calling her mom. Just as the word left his lips, his cell phone on the desk vibrated. The bright screen illuminated the dark room. Knowing how late it was, he instinctively reached over and picked up the phone to see who was texting him. The message was from his mother. The text read, "I am still at work." The young man froze. His heart stopped. He slowly dropped the phone onto his bed and looked back up at the dark doorway. The slouched figure standing just feet away from him was not his mother. Panic surged through his veins, but he knew he had to act quickly and think on his feet. He decided to play dumb, hoping the intruder would think he was just a confused teenager who thought his mom was in the room. He looked at the figure and said he needed to get to sleep, and told her to get out. The figure did not move an inch, moving as quietly as possible. The young man grabbed his phone again. With shaking fingers, he typed out a frantic text to his mother, telling her there was an intruder in the house, that he had mistaken them for her, and that she needed to call the police immediately. A few seconds later, his mother texted back, "Okay." Then, the silence in the bedroom was broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. The figure in the doorway began to speak. It was the voice of a woman, but it sounded incredibly old, crackly, and dry. She started repeating a single phrase over and over again in a low, raspy whisper. She was saying, "Don't know where to go." With every repetition, her voice grew louder and more frantic, and then she started walking toward his bed. The young man lost his composure. He screamed at her to get back, as he fumbled wildly in the dark for the switch to his bedside lamp. He finally clicked the light on, and the sudden brightness revealed a terrifying sight. Standing right beside his bed was an elderly woman. She had wild, wiry white hair that stood up in every direction. Her face was deeply wrinkled, and she had her hands stretched out toward him like claws. She was still chanting those same words, "Don't know where to go," over and over, her eyes wide and unfocused. Believing she was about to attack him, the young man screamed at her to get away. He scrambled to the opposite side of the bed, leaped onto the floor, and bolted out of the bedroom. As he crossed the threshold, he grabbed the door handle, slammed the door shut behind him, and threw his entire body weight against it. A second later, he felt a violent force push against the door from the inside. The old woman was trying to get out. She began banging frantically on the wood, screaming at the top of her lungs that she needed to get out. The young man held his position, pressing his shoulder hard against the door, refusing to let her open it. He could hear his phone ringing repeatedly in his room as his mother tried to call him. But he could not let go of the door handle. It felt like an eternity, but finally, he heard the heavy thud of the front door being kicked open downstairs, followed by the booming voices of police officers. The young man let go of the door, sprinted down the hallway, and ran down the stairs toward the officers. The old woman immediately burst out of the bedroom and came rushing down the stairs after him. The young man pointed at her and yelled for the police to stop her. The officers reacted instantly, grabbing the woman and pinning her against the wall before placing her in handcuffs. As they led her out to the patrol car, the police explained that they would need to evaluate her. It was later confirmed that the woman was suffering from a severe, unmedicated mental illness and had wandered away from her home. She had simply found the unlocked back door and walked inside. Though the situation ended without physical harm, the young man was left with a lasting psychological scar. To this day, whenever he hears a sound in his bedroom at night, he has to sit up and make sure there is no one standing in the darkness. Next, we travel to the rugged, isolated landscape of rural Colorado. Before moving out to the bustling cities of California, a young man lived on his father's massive ranch. The property was beautiful, spanning hundreds of acres of open land, but it was located literally in the middle of nowhere. Living in such an isolated area could be incredibly lonely, and creepy things tend to happen when you are miles away from civilization. Because the ranch was so isolated, trespassing was a common and dangerous issue. The family had dealt with hunters, drifters, and thieves wandering onto their land on multiple occasions. This was why the father kept 3 different firearms in the house. On one occasion, the father had even been forced to chase 2 armed trespassers off the property at gunpoint. The event in question took place in the middle of a hot June. The young man was home alone for the weekend. His parents were away on a much-needed vacation, and his younger brother was out spending the night at a friend's house. Because of the intense summer heat, the young man had opened all the windows in the house to let the cool night air circulate. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning, and he was sitting in the living room watching television. Suddenly, the bright motion-sensing spotlight on the back patio flickered on. The young man knew that this particular light was highly calibrated. It did not trigger for small animals like rabbits or birds. It only turned on when something large, like a human, moved directly in front of the sensor. His immediate thought was that his younger brother had returned home early. To be safe, he got up from the couch and looked out the window. He could not see anyone in the illuminated yard. He pulled out his phone and called his brother, but the call went straight to voicemail. He walked back to the living room and sat back down. A moment later, there was a sharp, loud knock at the front door. The front door had a small peephole. Because the ranch was so isolated, anyone who showed up at their door had to drive miles down a private dirt road to get there. Nobody ever showed up unannounced. The young man walked to the door and looked through the peephole, but the porch was completely empty. Thinking it might be a prank, perhaps his brother and his friends playing a game of ding-dong ditch, he decided to close the window blinds. He was starting to feel a creeping sense of paranoia that someone was watching him from the darkness. He sent his brother a text message, warning him that if he found out this was a joke, he would lock him out for the night. As he set his phone down, a violent knock sounded right against the glass of the window directly behind his head. The impact was so loud and sudden that the young man literally jumped off the couch in fright. But it was what came next that made his heart skip a beat. Through the glass, he heard 2 distinct voices speaking at the exact same time. One was a deep, gravelly male voice, and the other was a high-pitched female voice. Together, in perfect unison, they whispered, "We see you." The young man tried to convince himself that it was just his brother and his brother's girlfriend trying to scare him. It was the only logical explanation that kept him from completely panicking in the middle of nowhere. But the knocking did not stop. It moved from the living room window to the dining room window, where the blinds were still wide open. From his position in the hallway, the young man could see 2 dark silhouettes standing right outside the glass. The night was too dark to make out any of their facial features, but they were standing incredibly close to the house. Deciding he had had enough, the young man ran up a stairs to his father's bedroom. He knew exactly where his father kept his hunting rifle under the bed. He pulled the heavy gun out, loaded a round into the chamber, and ran back downstairs to the dining room. But when he looked through the window, the figures were gone. Armed with the loaded rifle, the young man felt a sudden surge of confidence. He decided he needed to secure the property and make sure no one was lurking near the livestock. He unlocked the front door, stepped out onto the porch, and began to conduct a sweep of the immediate area. He walked a full loop around the house, keeping his finger near the trigger. He checked the barn and verified that the cattle were calm and unharmed. Finding nothing, he went back inside, locked every single door and window, and headed upstairs to bed. For about 30 minutes, the house was dead silent. The young man began to relax, thinking the intruders had been scared off by his presence. Then, a terrifying sound erupted from downstairs. Someone was violently pounding on the front door with incredible force, as if they were trying to break it down. Accompanying the pounding was a man's voice, screaming at the top of his lungs. But he was not screaming words. It was a raw, guttural, animalistic shriek of pure rage. The young man grabbed the rifle from his bedside table ran to the open upstairs window and leaned out. Without hesitation, he pointed the barrel into the dark night sky and fired a loud warning shot. The gunshot echoed across the valley. Instantly, the screaming and pounding stopped. In the sudden quiet, the young man heard the heavy, frantic sound of 2 sets of footsteps sprinting off the wooden porch and disappearing into the darkness. The rest of the night passed without incident. The next day, the young man spoke to his brother and confirmed that he had been miles away the entire night. The 2 strangers who had terrorized the ranch were never identified. When his father returned home and heard the story, he expressed how proud he was of his son's bravery. The young man was simply grateful that his father kept firearms in the house, realizing how different that night could have turned out if he had been unarmed. Our final story takes place on a crisp spring night. A teenage girl was home alone, trying to pass the time by video chatting with her best friend Jordan on FaceTime. She was pacing back and forth in her upstairs bedroom, talking about school and their weekend plans. As she paced, she happened to glance out her bedroom window, which looked down onto the quiet street below. She noticed a figure standing directly under a streetlight. The man was standing completely still, facing her house. The girl stopped pacing and squinted, trying to get a better look. She realized with a jolt of discomfort that the man was staring directly up at her bedroom window. She immediately told Jordan what she was seeing and tried to aim her phone camera out the window to show her. Jordan, however, could only see darkness. She advised her friend to hang up and call her parents right away. The girl hung up the FaceTime call and dialed her mother. Since it was past midnight, she ended up waking her mother up. Her mother, sleepy and assuming it was just a random passerby, told her to simply turn off her bedroom lights, close the window blinds, and go to bed. She assured her daughter that the man would eventually walk away. The girl followed her mother's advice. She flipped off the light switch, pulled the blinds shut, and climbed into bed. But as she lay there in the dark, her curiosity and anxiety got the better of her. After a few minutes, she quietly got out of bed, crept to the window, and parted the blinds just enough to peek outside. To her horror, the man had not left. In fact, he had moved much closer. He was now standing on the sidewalk, directly in front of her yard, his face still tilted upward, staring intently at her dark window. Terrified, she immediately called the police. The emergency dispatcher asked if the suspect was holding any visible weapons. The girl replied that she could not tell from this distance. The dispatcher told her to remain calm, stay away from the window, and call back if the man stepped onto her property. She also promised that a patrol car would be dispatched to drive by the house to scare him off. The girl hung up and crawled back into her bed. She called Jordan back on FaceTime, needing the comfort of her friend's voice. They talked for about 5 minutes, trying to distract themselves, until Jordan suggested that it was time to check the window again, to see if the police had arrived. The girl crept back to the window and looked out. The street was empty. A few minutes later, she saw a police cruiser slowly roll down the block. The officer stopped the vehicle directly in front of her house and used the mounted spotlight to sweep the front yard, the porch, and the side gates. After finding nothing unusual, the patrol car slowly drove away. Relieved, the girl assumed the man had been scared off by the police presence. She thanked Jordan, hung up the call, and settled under her covers to finally get some sleep. She lay there for about 20 minutes, her body slowly starting to relax. But just as she was about to drift off, a loud, distinct creaking and cracking sound echoed from the wall outside her room. She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She went to the window and looked down into the yard, but she saw nothing. She assumed it was just the house settling or a branch brushing against the siding, and went back to bed. A few minutes later, the cracking sound returned. Only this time, it was much louder, followed by a heavy scraping sound. She looked over at her window, and her voice caught in her throat. Silhouetted against the moonlight was the dark figure of the man. He was standing on the narrow ledge directly outside her second-story window. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The cracking noises she had heard were the sounds of him scaling the side of her house, using the trim and the siding to climb up to her bedroom. The young girl panicked. She ran to the adjacent window, threw it open, and began screaming for help at the top of her lungs, hoping to wake her neighbors. At the same time, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911 again, pleading with the operator to send officers immediately. As she screamed, the man began to push against her bedroom window screen, trying to squeeze his body through the narrow opening. But before he could gain entry, a bright light flickered on at the neighbor's house. An elderly neighbor stepped onto his porch and began shouting at the intruder. Realizing he had lost the element of surprise, the intruder gave up his attempt to enter the room. He climbed down the side of the house, dropped to the ground, and sprinted down the dark street. The police arrived in force minutes later. They searched the neighborhood and took a detailed description of the suspect from both the girl and her elderly neighbor. Although the intruder was never apprehended, the police kept a close watch on the neighborhood for the rest of the night. The girl did not sleep a single wink, haunted by the realization of how close she had come to a face-to-face confrontation with a predator. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine working the night shift as a security guard in a massive empty office building in Manchester. It is the early hours of November 1st, 2012. Inside, the only sound is the low hum of the servers. The guard on duty is just sipping his coffee, looking at the security monitors, waiting for his shift to end. But then his eyes drift to camera 4. A heavy office chair in an empty cubicle begins to slide backward. It is not just a little vibration, it is a deliberate, steady pull. The guard leans closer, thinking maybe a draft caused it. But the problem was, there were no open vents nearby. And then, paper files start flying off the desks. Computer monitors begin to flicker and sway. Right before his eyes, some unseen powerful force is violently tossing items across the room. He starts frantically switching from camera to camera, watching this invisible entity literally wreck the workspace. This was not a quick glitch. It was a prolonged, aggressive display of physical force captured on tape. And so, we travel across the world to Australia, to the historic Carlisle Castle Hotel. This is an old pub where locals gather for a cold drink after work. One night, the CCTV cameras caught things that could not be explained. In the dining area, a white, transparent figure suddenly appears. It looks like the silhouette of a person, waving its arms slowly in front of the lens. This eerie movement goes on for nearly 30 seconds. Then the video cuts to the bar. The bartender opens the fridge. Right as he does, 2 heavy glass bottles fall out from one of the compartments. Now, the first bottle might have been sitting on the edge, which makes sense. But the second bottle follows right after, flying out at an angle that looks as if it were intentionally pushed by an invisible hand. Minutes later, a glass hanging high above the bar suddenly shatters onto the counter. No one was anywhere near it, it just fell and broke. It turns out the owner wondered if it was a clever hoax, but the staff was left completely terrified. Then we have the strange case of a young woman eating alone in a busy buffet restaurant. She was having a quiet, normal dinner, completely minding her own business. After a while, she stands up from her booth to go grab another plate of food. The surveillance camera is pointed directly at her table. The very second she walks away, the glasses and plates on her table begin to move. They do not just slide a little bit, they literally fly off the edge and crash onto the floor. At this point, the other customers sitting at nearby tables look over in complete shock. Now, if this were a hoax, someone would have had to attach invisible strings to all those dishes without anyone in the busy restaurant noticing. But the reactions of the nearby diners are completely genuine. They look confused and frightened, staring at the empty table, where dishes just decided to jump onto the ground on their own. Let us talk about another place we all visit, the local convenience store. In one video, a shopper is walking down the aisle, looking at the shelves. Suddenly, a small pink object floats out from a shelf right behind his head. At the exact same time, a yellow object of the same size falls off the shelf onto the ground. The man turns around, completely baffled, and picks them up. He looks around to see if anyone is playing a trick, but he is entirely alone in the aisle. Fast forward to the Brookside Theater in Romford. The manager, Jay Seal, came in on a Sunday morning to get things ready for the week. As he walked through the empty auditorium, he noticed one of the heavy chairs in the third row was completely out of line. He decided to check the CCTV footage from the night before. What he saw blew his mind. A chair in the empty room slowly moved backward, completely unassisted. At the same time, A table nearby was pulled across the floor, and strange orbs of light floated through the dark room. Jay later mentioned that he never usually checks the cameras unless there is a major incident. A local medium named Roy Roberts, who had performed at the theater the night before, believed this was clear evidence of a resident ghost who wanted to make its presence known. But things can get much worse. In a hotel dining room in Malaysia, a woman sitting alone saw the chairs around her begin to move on their own. Terrified, she tried to make a run for the exit, but the entity did not want her to leave. As she ran toward the door, a table and several chairs were violently thrown directly into her path, blocking her escape. Another heavy table was flung through the air, striking her and knocking her out cold on the floor. This was an aggressive, physical attack by an unseen force. Some of the most terrifying footage comes from people trying to document these things in their own homes. One YouTuber noticed his dog acting strange, trembling under the bed. The owner took out his camera to record his pet's behavior. He tried to coax the dog out, but the animal was frozen with fear. Suddenly, a loud, heavy knocking sound echoed from the dark attic right above them. The man walked up the stairs, camera in hand, his heart pounding. As he opened the attic hatch, the sheer terror of what he felt made him panic and run back down, completely shaken. When we look at all these cases, we have to ask ourselves a very difficult question. Are these videos just clever hoaxes, or are they real? Some people argue that with enough fishing line, editing software, and good acting, anyone can create a spooky video. But the sheer terror in the eyes of the people experiencing these events is incredibly hard to fake. The way the objects move, the physics of the falling items, and the raw reactions of witnesses suggest that something truly unexplained is happening around us. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, these security recordings offer a chilling glimpse into a world we do not fully understand. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was the late 2000s, and I was just a regular 14-year-old kid trying to survive my 8th grade year. This was the final stretch of middle school, a time when you feel like you are finally starting to grow up, but you are still very much a kid. On this particular day, I was sitting in my afternoon math class, completely bored. The teacher was droning on about algebra and I just could not focus. I really had to use the bathroom, so I raised my hand and asked to leave. The teacher gave me the hall pass, which back then was just this big clunky wooden plank. I took the wooden plank and walked out into the quiet hallway. As I walked down the main floor, I made my way toward the nearest bathroom, but I saw a bright sign taped to it saying out of order, "Please use the upstairs or downstairs restroom." Just as I turned around, a random older man walked up to me and asked with a friendly smile on his face if I knew where the nearest bathroom was. I told him he could use either the upstairs or downstairs one. He thanked me and walked to the stairs. To avoid any more potential conversation with him, I decided to go down to the lower level. I wondered who he could be, definitely not staff, maybe just a parent. The lower level was dead quiet, containing only 4 bathrooms and extra locker rooms for sports teams. I opened the door to the bathroom, and the light was off as usual since it was the least used one. I went into a stall, shut the door, covered the seat with paper, and sat down. Suddenly, there was a white light flashing in the bathroom, and I heard the high-pitched sound of the fire alarm outside. There was a fire drill. My heart dropped because I did not know what to do. It was the first fire drill of the school year. I wondered if I would get in trouble for just staying in the bathroom while everyone else was outside. At this point, I figured I would just stay put and do my business. The flashing light got a bit annoying, as did the alarm noise coming from the hallway. But then the sound of the alarm got much louder. I realized it was because the bathroom door had opened. Then over came marching somebody right to my stall door. I saw their feet underneath the stall gap. I thought for sure it was a teacher coming to check the room for any left-behind students. But they did not say anything at all. I did not know if I should speak up. I looked down at their shoes, which were just facing my door, but I noticed they were not just standing there. I looked through that dreaded 1-inch crack of the stall door that everybody hates. I saw someone's face pressed up against it. Most apparently, the man's eye was open as wide as possible, staring directly at me. Then there was a quiet chuckle from the other side. My breathing got heavy and my heart was racing. I did not know if I should scream. Then the person got on his knees and stuck his head underneath the stall to look at me. It was that same man from the hallway. When he saw it was me, he literally crawled under the door into the stall and grabbed a hold of me. The man covered my mouth instantly. The first thing I remember him saying was to not struggle and to just relax. I did not know what he was going to do to me. It was an unreal feeling, like my life was flashing before my eyes at such a young age. Then, the fire alarm got louder again as the bathroom door opened. It was the principal's voice echoing through the room, asking if anybody was in there. I screamed as hard as I could, and though my voice was muffled through the man's tight hand, the principal heard it. He came rushing over to the stall, screaming to open the door. The man let go of me, threw the stall door open right in the principal's face, and ran for it. The principal was a very old man, so he did not chase after him. The school also did not have any security cameras at this point, so as far as I know, the guy got away. The principal actually hugged me, and he was very emotional. He told me to come with him to the office so we could call my parents. All my friends saw me almost in tears walking with my parents to their car in the middle of the schoolyard. It was humiliating, but I was also just happy to be safe. The principal had actually seen the man pull the fire alarm and run downstairs, which is why he slowly but surely made his way down there to check the bathroom first. He unfortunately passed away 5 years ago, and I still have great appreciation for him. He was my hero. Fast forward to high school. Fire drills were usually a lot of fun back then, depending on what class you were in and which friends you were with. One particular dark and cloudy day during third period, my friends and I heard through the grapevine that there was going to be a fire drill. It was a Friday close to the end of the school year, and there was really no work left for us in our classes. So we figured that during the fire drill we would sneak down to the sump behind the school by the woods to smoke. We waited anxiously for that ear-piercing ringing to go off, and when it did, it was music to our ears. We looked at each other and laughed. We were the first ones out of the classroom and down the hall. While everyone else on our side of the school was headed to the front entrance, we were on our way to the back exit by the woods. We walked out in the middle of the crowd to the back section of the school near the basketball and tennis courts. We were pretty strategic about our escape. We made sure there were no teachers in sight, and then we crossed through a narrow opening between the tennis courts and a line of thick bushes that led straight to the sump. A couple of kids watched us leave, and they probably thought we were a bunch of weirdos, but it did not matter to us. We made it to the sump, which was literally a giant hole in the ground surrounded by bushes and trees right at the edge of the dark woods. The sump had a specific nickname among the students, but I do not remember what it was. All I know is that it was the place where everyone came to drink, smoke, and hang out at night. Kids even had bonfires there on the weekends. On this day, it was incredibly dark. The clouds were a darkish gray, giving the morning an early night kind of feeling. The cool breeze eerily hinted at a storm approaching, which honestly just made the whole escape feel more fun. We waited until all the commotion up the hill quieted down, assuming everyone had gone back inside the building. Then we started talking and laughing. My friend went through his backpack to get out his pipe and grinder. That was when I noticed something strange in the distance by the edge of the woods. It looked kind of like a person's face. A couple of low shrubs covered where the body would be, but what I saw just looked too much like a face. I looked away for a split second to get my friend's attention, and then I pointed in that direction. But when I looked back, the face was completely gone. They thought I was an idiot, but now that it was gone, I was about 70% sure what I had seen was a real person. The other 30% of me wondered if I was just imagining things in the dark. They did not want to move though, so I stayed put. We smoked, and the higher I got, the more paranoid I became. I never really enjoyed smoking too much for that reason, but I went along with it because it was what my group did. Now that I was high, all I could think about was that face in the woods. Did someone see us? And were we going to get in trouble? That was all that occupied my mind. Suddenly, my friends wanted to walk through the woods to an old shack that used to be used by the school for storage. It was about a minute walk into the thick woods. I was incredibly uncomfortable with the idea. The air started to feel very moist, and I started to feel those tiny pre-storm rain droplets hitting my face. Once again, I warned them that we should go back because of the approaching storm, but they ignored me. On the way there, I swore I could hear footsteps that were not ours. But honestly, I was so high that I did not even know where I was hearing them from. Were they in front of us, behind us, to the left, or to the right? I had no idea. Then, from behind us, I was absolutely sure I heard a big stick snap in half. I stopped and turned around, loudly asking what that was. My friends stopped too, but they had not heard a thing. There was nobody visible behind us, and once again, they thought I was losing my mind. I became the blunt of all their jokes as we kept walking. The big old shack finally came into view. It was bigger than I remembered, and it looked incredibly creepy. The school had stopped using this building years ago, probably because it looked like it was about to collapse. Even the path leading to the front door had tall grass growing through the cracks. The front door was wedged open. Surely, other students came in there all the time. My friend Jack pushed the door fully open with force. It was so dark inside. There was very little light from outside to begin with. It seemed like there was just a bunch of old empty crates, many of them smashed to pieces. There was also a nasty, rotting smell in the air, one that my friends did not remember from the last time they were in there. Suddenly, the sound of something squishy plopping on the ground, followed by a heavy foot hitting the wood floor, made us all jump. In the corner of the room was the shadow outline of a really tall person. We could only see him due to the tiny amount of light sneaking in through the dusty window. We did not scream or anything. We simply turned around, walked out the door the way we came, and walked quickly back in the direction of the school. All three of us took a look back at the window nearest to where the person had been standing. I swear to God, at that exact moment, the first flash of lightning struck the sky. What we saw during that flash was nothing short of horrifying. There was a guy with a seriously deformed face standing at the window. Half of his face seemed to be drooping down, and you could not even see one of his eyes. He was so close to the glass that his face was practically pressed up against it. I started running, and my friends followed right behind me. We got back down to the sump in less than a minute as the rain started to fall. Just then, my friend Jack pointed up the hill back toward the woods. There was a person standing behind a shrub, exposing only his face, just like what I had seen before. This time he was 10 times closer, but still not close enough to describe his features. All I know is that it was not the same deformed person from the shack. We ran back to the school and hid by the back entrance where it was dry. We all agreed to just go home, forget about what just happened, and never speak of that shack again. And that was exactly what we did. But our school had another secret. There was a door that led down to a half stairway to some weird dark hallway. A lot of students knew about it, but nobody really knew what was down there. The door only seemed to be unlocked during fire drills, when every door in the building opens for safety. My friend Kyle and I were particularly interested in finding out what was down there. I was a pretty bad student in my first 2 years of high school, so planning to venture down there during a fire drill was typical for us. Luckily, it happened during study hall. As the alarm rang, Kyle and I ran to one of the bathrooms, which had its door wedged open. We hid in the stalls until the hallway was clear and everyone was outside. Then, getting down those basement stairs was easy. There was a very dim light hanging from the ceiling, giving just enough light to see a doorway that led to another half flight of stairs in complete darkness. We used our phone screens to navigate the dark. We found a door marked "Do Not Enter" and pushed it open. Inside was a tiny room. We heard a clicking sound and human groans coming from a floor vent. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the metal grate to listen. Suddenly, a cold hand reached out and grabbed my ear. I screamed, and Kyle pulled the hand off. We ran out in terror. The next day, the janitor told us that room had been locked for years and the vent was sealed. We had no idea who was hiding in that shaft. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to make a massive change in my life. I packed up everything I owned into the back of my old sedan and moved to a very small, quiet town in rural Illinois. At the time, I only knew one single person in the entire area, and being a pretty quiet, introverted guy in my early 20s, making new friends was not exactly easy for me. To make things even more challenging, the town was mostly made up of retired folks, so there was not exactly a bustling social scene for someone my age. My only friend in town, a girl I will call Clara, noticed that I was struggling to adjust and wanted to help me find a way to make some extra money and maybe build some local connections. One afternoon, Clara called me up and told me about an older couple in their early 50s who lived just outside of town and were desperately looking for a trustworthy dog sitter. She figured it would be the perfect low-stress gig for me, especially since I worked from home and could easily watch the dogs while doing my regular job. I thought it sounded like a great opportunity, so we set up a time for me to go over to their house, meet the owners, and get a feel for the property. The drive out to their house was long and winding. The property was situated in a highly secluded area, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to isolate it completely from the rest of the world. When I finally pulled up the driveway, I saw a large, brick ranch-style house that looked straight out of the 1970s. It was severely outdated, and you could tell that certain parts of the structure were starting to fall apart, but I actually found it somewhat charming. In my spare time, I love to go urban exploring and look inside abandoned buildings, so an old, slightly run-down house did not bother me in the least. The couple met me at the front door, and while they were friendly enough, I immediately noticed some highly unusual behavior. Instead of making normal eye contact with me while we were talking, both of the owners kept doing this strange, slow, full body scan of me, almost as if they were sizing me up or trying to calculate something. It made me feel incredibly self-conscious and a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off, telling myself they were probably just protective of their home. As they began to show me around the house, they did not really say much of anything. They would simply walk me to a room, open the door, stand there in complete silence while I looked inside, and then close the door before moving to the next one. It was one of the most awkward home tours I had ever experienced. During the tour, I also noticed something else that was hard to ignore. This couple ran a side business selling firearms directly out of their home. Now, I did not really have an issue with that. But what did make me uncomfortable was the sheer number of security cameras they had set up. There were cameras absolutely everywhere. They were positioned outside the house, in the hallways, the living room, the kitchen, the office, the garage, the backyard, the driveway, and there was even one pointed directly at the kitchen table. When I asked about them, the husband laughed and told me it was purely for insurance purposes, because of their firearm business. While that explanation made logical sense, having that many lenses tracking my every move made me feel like I was going to be living in a fishbowl. Still, I was desperate for the extra income and wanted to establish myself in this new town, so I agreed to the job. The couple was scheduled to go on vacation for an entire week, leaving me alone with their two sweet dogs. When the day finally arrived, the couple departed early in the morning, and I moved my things into their house. Since I worked from home, I decided to set up my temporary workspace in their home office. The office actually had a large monitor that displayed the feeds from all of the outdoor security cameras simultaneously. This turned out to be a bit of a relief because being alone on a massive, isolated property in the middle of nowhere could get a little spooky, and having eyes on the entire perimeter made me feel much more secure. Another thing to note was that the dogs had a doggy door installed, which allowed them to go outside into the fenced backyard 24 hours a day. The backyard backed up directly to the dense dark woods, and during the daytime, the view was beautiful. But once the sun went down, those woods looked like a black wall. The first night went by without any issues. I worked, hung out with the dogs, and slept soundly. But on the second night, things took a turn. I was sitting at the desk in the office around 10 in the evening when I glanced over at the security monitor and noticed that the camera watching the driveway had gone completely offline. I did not panic because I knew that wireless internet out in rural areas could be incredibly spotty and finicky. However, being the responsible house sitter, I decided I should go ahead and check on it, just in case the camera had physically fallen from its mount or something had damaged it. As I stood up and started walking toward the front door, I suddenly heard the dogs scramble frantically off the living room floor. They bolted through the doggy door into the backyard, barking louder and more aggressively than I had ever heard them bark before. The sudden noise in the dead of night sent a massive jolt of adrenaline through my body. I walked quickly to the back door, hoping to call the dogs back inside before they disturbed any distant neighbors or, worse, got into a fight with a wild animal. When I peered through the glass of the back door, I could see both dogs standing at the far end of the yard, pressed against the wooden fence that bordered the woods. They were barking furiously at one exact spot in the tree line. I stared into the darkness, straining my eyes to see if there was a deer, a raccoon, or maybe a stray dog out there, but I could not see a single thing. My mind immediately began to play tricks on me, conjuring up scenes from every horror movie I had ever watched. I knew I had to get the dogs back inside immediately so I could lock the door and calm down. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a handful of high-value dog treats, and managed to lure them back into the house. Once they were safely inside, I decided I was not taking any chances. I grabbed a heavy wooden chair from the dining room, shoved it tightly against the doggy door to completely block it off, and went to bed, trying to convince myself it was just a wild animal. The next morning, I woke up much later than I had intended. I felt completely thrown off and realized I had to jump straight into a work meeting before I even had time to feed the dogs. As I sat in bed opening my laptop, I suddenly realized how quiet the house was. Normally, the dogs would be jumping on the bed or nudging my arm for breakfast, but they were nowhere to be found. I got out of bed, walked down the hallway, and called their names, but there was no response. My heart began to beat a little faster as I made my way toward the back of the house. I looked out the window, and to my absolute shock, I saw both dogs casually trotting around the backyard, doing their usual morning routine. At first, my brain could not process what I was seeing, and then a wave of cold dread washed over me. How on earth did they get outside? I had blocked the doggy door with a heavy wooden chair the night before. I slowly turned my head to the right, looking toward the spot where the doggy door was located. My heart sank, and I felt all of the blood completely rush from my head. The heavy chair that I had pushed tightly against the doggy door was no longer there. It was now sitting neatly in the far corner of the room, 5 feet away from the door. A feeling of absolute panic set in. There was absolutely no physical way those dogs, even working together, could have moved that heavy chair 5 feet across the room and placed it neatly in the corner. Someone had to have moved it. Someone had been inside the house while I was sleeping. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and called Clara, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. I told her I was terrified and needed her to come over immediately to help me search the house. Clara could hear the sheer terror in my voice and promised she would be there in 20 minutes. While I waited, I stood right by the front door, ready to run outside if I heard even the slightest sound from within the house. When Clara arrived, I let her in, and we immediately began a meticulous, room-by-room walkthrough of the entire house. We checked every single closet, looked under every bed, and even searched the crawl spaces, but we found absolutely nothing. The house was completely empty. Clara, trying to be the voice of reason, suggested that perhaps I had been so tired the night before that I had not actually pushed the chair as far over as I thought I did. She suggested that maybe the dogs had nudged it just enough to squeeze through. Deep down, I knew that was impossible, but because I did not want to seem like a paranoid coward, I decided to just accept her explanation. I told myself I would just have to push through the next 4 days of the job by staying on an incredibly high alert. Clara left, and I went back to my work, trying my best to settle my frayed nerves. The rest of the day went by quietly. The silence of the rural property actually began to feel peaceful again, and I started to relax as the afternoon faded into the evening. I made myself some dinner, finished up my work tasks, and went back to the office to check the security monitor one last time before bed. As I looked at the screen, my stomach completely dropped. Every single camera view on the monitor was black. All 4 cameras had gone completely offline at the exact same time. I knew that a single camera going down could be attributed to poor internet connection, but all 4 going down simultaneously was a statistical impossibility. This had to be intentional. Because of the nature of the couple's business, and the fact that they had high-value firearms on the property, I felt a responsibility to let them know. I sent a text message to the wife, explaining that all of their security cameras had suddenly gone down and offering to troubleshoot the system for them if they wanted. More than anything, I wanted those cameras back up because I hated the idea of being completely blind to what was happening outside in the dark. I waited for a couple of hours, but I received no response. I figured they were on vacation, probably asleep or enjoying themselves, so I would just have to suck it up and wait until morning. By midnight, I was lying in bed with the television on, using the background noise to drown out the oppressive silence of the empty house. Suddenly, the dogs bolted upright. They scrambled out of the bed and ran frantically toward the back of the house. My heart began pounding violently against my ribs. I knew deep in my gut that something was horribly wrong. I reached down, grabbed a large kitchen knife that I had placed on the nightstand, and crept slowly out of the bedroom. I walked toward the back door, peering out into the dark yard. The dogs had already stopped barking, and were now just pacing back and forth, sniffing along the wooden fence. I opened the door slightly and tried to whisper yell to get them to come back inside. But just as I did, a loud, heavy thump echoed from the complete opposite side of the house. I froze in place. My mind was racing, forced to make a split-second decision. Do I stay here and try to get the dogs in, or do I go investigate the source of that terrifying noise? I decided to get the dogs inside first, dragging them into the living room and sliding the heavy chair back in front of the doggy door. This time, I pulled out my phone and took a clear photo of the chair blocking the door, just to prove to myself later that I had actually done it. With the knife tightly gripped in my hand, I made my way toward the back room where the thump had originated. The moment I stepped into the hallway leading to that room, I felt a physical shift in the air. It is hard to describe to someone who has never experienced it, but when there is another human presence in a room, the atmosphere completely changes. The air feels heavier, and there is a sort of subtle white noise in the silence, a tiny break in the stagnancy of the empty space. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was not alone. I was not about to walk blindly into the dark room to investigate, so I stood in the hallway and called out, asking who was there and what they were doing. My words were met with absolute silence. I then called out the names of the homeowners, thinking that maybe they had returned early from vacation and were playing some sort of bizarre prank on me, but again, nothing but silence. I thought about calling Clara, but she had a young child and a husband, and I did not want to wake her up over what might turn out to be nothing. I also thought about calling the police, but a sudden wave of embarrassment washed over me. I imagined the officers arriving, finding absolutely nothing, and thinking I was just a paranoid idiot who could not handle being alone in an old house. I slowly backed out of the hallway, reached out, quietly closed the door to that back room, and locked it from the outside. I went back to the living room, sat on the couch with the dogs, and sat there with my phone in one hand and the kitchen knife in the other, completely unable to decide what to do next. About 20 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from the wife. The text read, "Hi, don't worry about the cameras, you are safe." I stared at the screen, completely thrown off. First of all, they were vacationing in Florida, which meant it was almost 2 in the morning where they were. Why was she texting me so late? And more importantly, why did she say I was safe? I had only texted her about the cameras being down. I had never mentioned anything about feeling unsafe. It was an incredibly bizarre choice of words. I started typing out a generic polite reply, but before I could hit send, another text message from her popped up on my screen. The text read, "Also, can you make sure that I didn't leave the garage door open to the inside? I don't want anything getting in." My chest tightened. The door she was referring to, the one leading from the garage into the house, was located inside that exact back room where I had heard the loud thump and felt that terrifying presence. There was absolutely no way I was going to go back into that room. I decided to simply ignore the message, pretending that I had already fallen asleep and had not seen it. But just 2 minutes later, she texted again. It read, "Hi, I know it is late, but can you please check on this for me as I am worried?" My gut was absolutely screaming at me not to go. Every survival instinct I had was telling me to stay on that couch. But then, a small part of my brain tried to rationalize the situation. What if a wild animal had indeed gotten into the garage and was trying to claw its way into the house? What if that was the thump I heard? With my phone and knife still tightly gripped, I slowly stood up and walked back toward the locked door of the back room. As I approached the door, I stopped and pressed my ear against the wood. I heard a faint, distinct shuffling sound coming from the other side. I stood there, completely paralyzed, trying to decide if I should open it. Suddenly, my phone screen lit up in my hand with another text message from the wife. It read, "I see you are up. Can you please go in and check?" I felt a wave of icy terror wash over me. I had completely forgotten that they had security cameras inside the hallway and the living room. The cameras inside were still working, and they were actively watching me. Why were they watching me on their security feed at 1 in the morning, while they were supposed to be on vacation in Florida? And why were they pushing me so aggressively to open that specific door? Realizing that I was being watched, and feeling an immense pressure to comply, I reluctantly unlocked the door and pushed it open. I stretched my arms out as far as they could go, keeping myself as far back from the threshold as possible to get a wide view of the room. The room was dark, and I could not hear or see anything unusual. I took 2 slow, cautious steps into the room. The door to the garage was indeed standing wide open, revealing a yawning black void. It was pitch black inside the garage, and I had no desire to get any closer to it. But just as I was about to turn around and run, my phone screen lit up with another notification. The faint blue glow from the screen cast a tiny bit of light into the open doorway of the garage. Just 2 steps away from me, in the dim light, I saw the clear, unmistakable outline of a human arm pressed flat against the wall right next to the doorframe. Someone was hiding just inside the garage, waiting for me to walk through the door. My fight-or-flight response kicked in with absolute blinding intensity. I did not think. I simply spun on my heel, bolted out of the room, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. I sprinted into the kitchen, grabbed my car keys off the counter, and ran straight out the front door into the cold night air. My hands were shaking so violently that I fumbled with the keys, struggling to unlock my car. As I finally got the door open and climbed inside, I glanced back at the house. The large garage door was slowly opening, lifting halfway up into the air. I started my car, and as the headlights flicked on, they illuminated the interior of the partially opened garage. There, in the far corner, squatting behind a cardboard box right next to the door I had been about to close, was a grown man wearing a dark jacket. I did not waste a single fraction of a second. I slammed the car into reverse, floored the gas pedal, and went flying down the long driveway. I drove directly to the nearest police station, tears of pure terror streaming down my face. When I burst through the doors of the station, I was hyperventilating, barely able to form coherent sentences. I managed to explain to the officers what had happened, and they immediately dispatched a unit to go check out the property. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot, my body shaking uncontrollably. I decided to text the wife, telling her that there was an intruder in her house, and asking her to check the security cameras to see if she could see him. I received absolutely no response. About half an hour later, the police officer returned to the station. He walked over to my car and told me that the garage door was indeed wide open when they arrived, but the house was completely clear. There were no signs of a forced entry, and they had checked the entire perimeter of the yard and found nothing out of the ordinary. The officer could see that I was completely out of my mind with fear, so he kindly offered to let me follow him back to the property, so he could do one final walkthrough with me there to prove it was safe. Once we did the search, and I saw with my own eyes that no one was inside, the officer wished me a good night and left. I knew there was absolutely no way I was going to be able to sleep. It was already approaching 4 in the morning, so I just lay on the living room couch with the dogs, wide awake. My fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of the kitchen knife. About 20 minutes after the police officer left, my phone buzzed with another text from the wife. It read, "Hi, plans changed. We will be home soon. You can go home now." I stared at the message in utter disbelief. They were completely disregarding the fact that a terrifying intruder had just been inside their home, a situation that I had literally just texted her about. Furthermore, they were suddenly coming home 4 days early, without warning, and would be there in just a couple of hours. I did not want to spend another second trying to analyze their bizarre behavior. I grabbed my bags, loaded them into my car, and left. The home was located on a secluded rural road, about a quarter of a mile from the main street. As I drove down the road and approached the stop sign, I happened to glance in my rearview mirror. My heart stopped. A dark car, driving with its headlights completely turned off, slowly pulled into the couple's driveway. I quickly grabbed my phone and sent a text to the wife, saying that someone had just pulled into her driveway as I was leaving. Almost instantly, a reply popped up on my screen. It read, "I know." Chills ran down my spine, and a sickening realization washed over me. They were setting me up. They had been in the area the entire time. They had never been in Florida. The dogs barking in the middle of the night on the previous days had been alerting me to the fact that they were driving their car along the hidden path behind the woods. They had intentionally shut off the outdoor security cameras, so I could not see them creeping around the property while I was inside. Completely oblivious. They had used the indoor cameras to watch my movements and tried to bait me into the dark garage where that man was waiting. I never heard from that couple ever again. Clara profusely apologized to me, swearing up and down that she had no idea how deeply disturbed they were. She told me she only knew them as regular customers who came into the local diner where she worked. After that terrifying incident, Clara said she never saw them come into the diner again. I am 30 years old now, and I still struggle to process what happened to me that night. I know that I am safe now, but the realization that I was just seconds away from God knows what is a feeling that I can never shake. A few years after that incident, I moved to a busy suburb just outside of Baltimore and took a job working as a bartender at a local bar and restaurant. To understand this next experience, you really have to understand the unique layout of the place. It was a very popular spot, but it had a highly unconventional way of operating. There were absolutely no waiters or waitresses on staff. Instead, there were only bartenders like myself and the kitchen cooks in the back. If a customer wanted to order food or non-alcoholic drinks, they had to walk up to the bar, place their order directly with us, and then pick it up from the counter when it was ready. I never quite understood why management chose to run the place this way, though I suspect it was just a cheap tactic to avoid paying a full waitstaff. Despite the odd setup, it kept the work incredibly fast-paced, which I actually really enjoyed. The place was constantly packed, especially on the weekends. The atmosphere was always incredibly lively, with great music playing, a buzzing crowd, and a large standing area near the DJ booth where people would gather to dance and socialize. Because of the constant flow of people, my shifts usually flew by, and since I love talking to new people, it was pretty much the perfect gig for me. I would have probably lost my mind if I had to stand around waiting for hours between serving customers. One particular weekend night started off like any other. It was a Friday, which meant we were gearing up for a massive rush. By 9 in the evening, the bar was completely slammed. It was a heavily college-aged crowd that night, which always meant a rowdier environment, lots of spilled drinks, and unfortunately, much smaller tips. I was running around behind the bar, trying to keep up with a group of kids who kept ordering endless rounds of tequila shots, when I happened to glance across the room. I saw an elderly couple walk through the front door and make their way toward a booth in the far corner of the restaurant. At first glance, there was nothing particularly strange about them. I just found it a little interesting that two people of their advanced age would choose to come into such a loud, chaotic, and rowdy bar on a Friday night. I did not have much time to dwell on it, so I immediately went back to pouring drinks. About 45 minutes to an hour passed. I was in the middle of mixing a long line of gin and tonics, my hands moving on pure muscle memory, when my eyes drifted back over to that corner booth. The moment I looked at them, my brain froze. The elderly couple was sitting completely motionless. They had not ordered any food, and they did not have any drinks on their table. I knew for a fact that they had not come up to the bar to order, because I would have remembered serving them. But what was even stranger was that they were not even looking at each other. They were both sitting perfectly upright, staring intently at the blank wall directly next to their booth. They were not talking, they were not moving, and they did not appear to be paying any attention to the loud music or the crowd around them. It was one of the most bizarre things I had ever seen. I was incredibly curious, but the bar was still slammed, so I had to put it out of my mind and keep working. When the rush finally started to slow down a bit, I decided to go over and check on them. I figured they might be first-time visitors who did not understand that we did not have waiters, and they were probably just waiting for someone to take their order. I put on my best customer service smile and walked over to their table. As I approached, neither of them turned their heads to acknowledge me. They remained completely still, staring at the wall like a pair of wax statues. I cleared my throat politely and asked if I could get them anything to eat or drink. The woman did not even flinch. She did not blink. She did not move. She just kept her eyes locked on the wall. The man, however, slowly began to turn his head toward me. His movements were incredibly slow, almost like he was moving underwater. When his face finally came into full view, a cold shiver ran straight down my spine. His skin was incredibly pale, almost gray and heavily wrinkled. His eyes were deeply sunken into his skull, looking like two dark hollows. He did not say a word. He just stared at me with an incredibly intense, vacant gaze, and then shook his head once, very firmly and silently. Something about his expression and the general energy coming off of him made my stomach instantly twist into a knot. I mumbled a quick apology, turned around, and practically sprinted back to the safety of the bar. I could not shake the incredibly weird feeling in my gut. Those people did not look like they belonged in a rowdy college bar. Honestly, they did not look like they belonged in this century. I deliberately avoided looking over at that corner booth for the next hour, focusing entirely on my work. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced over toward their table, and the moment I did, I nearly dropped the glass I was drying. Both the man and the woman had turned their bodies completely around in the booth, and were now staring directly at me. They were not blinking. They were just staring at me with those vacant, hollow eyes. I tried to make direct eye contact with the woman, hoping she would look away out of politeness, but she did not avert her gaze for even a second. It was the most uncomfortable and deeply unsettled I had ever felt in my life. I quickly looked away, pretending to clean the taps, and tried my best to ignore them. By the time I finally gathered the courage to look back over, the booth was completely empty. They were gone. A massive wave of relief washed over me. I was just incredibly glad that they had left. At the end of the shift, as I was wiping down the bar and closing up the register with my coworker Karen, I decided to bring it up. Karen was what you would call a veteran bartender. She had been working at this location for years, and prided herself on knowing every regular and noticing every single person who walked through the doors. I asked her if she had noticed that incredibly creepy elderly couple sitting in the corner booth earlier. Karen stopped counting her cash, gave me a highly confused look, and said she had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. I told her they were sitting in the far corner booth for hours, not ordering anything, just staring at the wall. Karen shook her head firmly and said she had been watching that side of the room all night, and there had never been an elderly couple in that booth. She even joked that I must be hallucinating from working too many late shifts. I laughed along with her, but on the inside my mind was racing. I knew what I had seen. I asked her if she was absolutely sure, and she crossed her arms and easily listed off about 10 other customers who had been sitting in that general area, describing exactly what they were wearing and what they had ordered. There was no way Karen would have missed them. By the time we finished locking up the building, I had actually started to doubt my own sanity. I walked out to the parking lot, my mind a complete fog, but as I reached my car, I saw something that made me freeze in absolute terror. Across the street, standing directly under a single flickering streetlight, were two dark figures. Even in the dim light, I knew exactly who they were. It was the elderly couple. They were standing side by side, perfectly still, staring directly across the street at me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was completely dry. I did not wait another second. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the parking lot as fast as my car would go, never looking back. The drive home was a nightmare. I kept crying, repeating the words, "Oh my God," over and over again. I had so many terrifying questions. Did Karen really not see them? Were they even real people? Was I losing my mind? I never saw those people again, and I never got an explanation. It is a mystery that still haunts me to this day. A few years later, I met a guy who became one of my closest friends. He told me a story about his father that was so deeply unsettling it has stayed with me ever since. His father worked as a logger in the dense, isolated forests of the Pacific Northwest. Specifically, he was a tree saw operator, which meant he operated a massive, incredibly dangerous machine designed to cut down giant trees and slice them to specific lengths. The job required long, grueling hours of intense physical labor, and he was often completely alone in some of the most remote wilderness areas in the country, because the logging crew was paid based on the volume of wood they cleared, rather than the hours they worked. His father would often push himself to work 16 to 20-hour days to finish jobs ahead of schedule. Once he and his partner finished cutting down the trees, the rest of the heavy crew would come in with trucks to transport the timber to the mill. His father spent about half of his time working entirely alone, but the other half was spent working alongside his close friend Griffin, who was also a tree saw operator. Because they were often positioned on opposite ends of a massive job site, they relied heavily on two-way radios to communicate. Several years ago, his father and Griffin were assigned to a highly remote job site located high up on an isolated mountain. The location was so inaccessible that it took the logging company's road crew over 3 weeks just to clear a dirt path wide enough for their heavy equipment to reach the site. By the time they actually began cutting timber, they were miles away from any form of civilization, surrounded by nothing but endless, dense forest. They were about 10 days into the job, making excellent progress, when they suddenly started hearing strange, faint chatter coming over their two-way radios. At first, the voices were incredibly muffled and distorted by static, making it impossible to understand what was being said. They tried switching to different channels, but to their confusion, the strange chatter seemed to follow them, no matter which frequency they chose. Anyone who has ever used standard radio equipment knows that this should be technically impossible unless someone was actively scanning and matching their channels. As they moved further up the mountain, clearing trees as they went, the voices on the radio became clearer and more distinct. They still could not make out full, coherent conversations, but the general tone of the voice fragments they captured felt deeply off. His father said the voices sounded almost entirely casual, yet the content of what they were saying remained completely unintelligible, almost like they were speaking in a strange code or a language he had never heard before. To make matters worse, they also started finding physical signs that other people were living on the mountain. They found random plastic containers left in the brush, strange footprints in the mud, and small, crude makeshift campsites hidden deep in the trees. Given how incredibly remote and inaccessible this area was, these discoveries were deeply alarming. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to be up there. One afternoon, Griffin was working near a hidden game trail when he spotted a small, camouflage tent pitched deep in the thicket. He immediately radioed his father, and the two of them decided to go investigate. They approached the tent cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was inside, but there was no response. They decided to open the flap and look inside. Inside the tent, they found a single sleeping bag and a large duffel bag. When they zipped open the duffel bag, they were met with some of the most horrifying and disturbing items imaginable. The bag was filled with multiple pairs of children's underwear. I am 24 years old, and back in the spring of 2020, I was still living at home with my mom, my dad, and my 2 younger siblings. Right around March, which was exactly when the coronavirus pandemic started to get really serious, and everyone was being forced into quarantine, my parents bought a brand new house. It was a beautiful 2-story property in a quiet neighborhood. Because of the sudden lockdown, we spent our first few weeks there entirely focused on the unpacking and settling in phase. It was a stressful time to move, but we tried to make the best of it. My bedroom was located in the basement. I actually did not mind this setup at all, because the basement was the farthest away from my parents' room, which gave me a lot of privacy. Technically, the room I slept in was just an extra utility room that was never really meant to be used as a bedroom, but we cleaned it up and made it work. Plus, my parents figured I would be moving out on my own pretty soon anyway, so they did not see any point in giving me one of the nicer, larger bedrooms upstairs. The basement in this new house was absolutely massive. It was a really cool space, and because my bedroom was down there, I felt like the entire basement was basically my own private apartment. But right off the bat, almost immediately after we moved in, weird things started happening inside my bedroom. Most of these strange occurrences happened late at night. I would lie in bed and hear strange scraping sounds coming from the walls. One night, I got up and knocked on the drywall, and it sounded completely hollow. There was a small metal air vent right above my bed. I figured a small animal was trapped inside. I turned on my iPhone flashlight to look through the slats, but the duct was too dark to see anything. I assumed it was normal house noises, but decided that if the sounds continued, I would ask my dad to look into it. To keep myself entertained during the quarantine, I set up my Xbox on the big TV in the main part of the basement. My dad had mounted a 50-inch screen down there, and I usually preferred to hang out in the open basement area rather than staying cooped up in my bedroom. One night, during our very first week in the house, I was playing Call of Duty Warzone. I was wearing my gaming headset, completely absorbed in the match, when I suddenly heard a very distinct, sharp sound. The noise came from the side of the basement where my bedroom was. It was muffled by the wall, which made me believe it had originated from inside my room. I quickly paused my game, took off my headset, and walked over to investigate. I pushed the door open, but the room was completely empty. Eager not to let my character die in the middle of the game, I hurried back to the TV. But as I sat down, I kept thinking about the sound. The best way to describe it was the sound of a heavy glass object, like a thick mug, being placed firmly onto a wooden table. I tried to convince myself that the sound had actually come from upstairs and had just vibrated down through the floorboards. The very next night, I was deeply asleep when I was suddenly awakened by some weird, muffled thumping sounds. I lay there in the dark, trying to figure out if the noise was coming from directly above my ceiling or from the side of my room. I grabbed my phone, walked over to the air vent, and shone the light inside once again. Just like before, I saw absolutely nothing. I was starting to get genuinely worried that we had a major rodent infestation inside the walls, so the next morning, I brought it to my dad's attention. He told me to let him know if the sounds continued, and he suggested that I try to record them on my phone if I heard them again. A few nights later, I woke up at around 4 o'clock in the morning, feeling incredibly thirsty. I reached for the water bottle I always kept on my bedside table, but it was completely empty. I had no choice but to head upstairs to the kitchen to get a refill. After filling my bottle with cold water, I began my descent back down the dark basement stairs. Midway down the staircase, in the pitch black, I froze. I thought I heard a faint, rustling noise coming from the bottom of the steps. I paused and whispered, "Hello," thinking that maybe one of my younger siblings was hiding in the dark to scare me. There was no response. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it down the remaining stairs to get some peace of mind. The basement was completely clear. I sighed, walked into my bedroom, and placed my water bottle on the small wooden ledge directly above my bed. But as I did, a sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread washed over me. My gut was screaming at me to look at the air vent in the wall one more time. I turned, lifted my phone, and flashed the light directly into the metal vent. It only lasted for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. Through the narrow metal slats, a pair of human eyes was staring directly back at me. They were wide, clear as day, reflecting the bright light of my phone. The moment the light hit them, the eyes quickly vanished backward into the dark void behind the wall. I did not look closer. I screamed, dropped my phone, and bolted out of the room, running up the stairs to find my dad. My family came downstairs, and I pointed at the vent. My dad took a look inside with a flashlight, but there was nothing there. My parents tried to convince me that I was just exhausted, seeing things because of a lack of sleep, and letting my imagination run wild. I did not believe them for a second. I refused to sleep in the basement that night. I grabbed a blanket, slept on the living room couch upstairs, and made sure the basement door was locked. The basement door only had a lock because of an outdoor entrance. The next afternoon, I went back down to grab some of my things and made a shocking discovery. On the far wall, a small wood panel was sitting slightly open. I called my dad downstairs, and together we pulled the panel back. It revealed a tiny hidden crawl space. On the dusty floor lay a blanket and a small wooden stool. We followed a narrow, dark corridor that stretched along the side of the house. At the very end, we found ourselves staring directly through the back of the air vent and into my bedroom. The realization hit us like a tidal wave. A stranger had been living inside our walls. They had been sneaking out at night to steal food from our kitchen, and they had been sitting on that stool, staring through the vent at me while I slept. When I had screamed the night before, the intruder must have realized they were caught, and fled through the outdoor basement exit. We immediately changed all the locks, but the thought of those eyes in the vent still keeps me awake at night. Fast forward to April of 2020. I was living in a duplex. The house was split in two. Each side had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen. There was a connecting door between the two sides, but the lock was on the other side. My landlord Jose lived there. He had complete control of the door. I was not comfortable with this, so I installed a security camera in my living room, aiming it right at that door. One afternoon, while sitting in my car, my phone alerted me to motion. I opened the app and saw the connecting door open. Jose walked into my apartment. He stayed for a minute and then left. I raced home, but nothing was touched. That night, I confronted him. Jose claimed he smelled a burning odor and came in to check the stove. It seemed like a reasonable excuse, so I let it go. A few days later, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was on a late Zoom call. My phone buzzed again with a motion alert. I closed my laptop and stepped into the pitch-black living room. Standing in the corner was Jose. He was holding something in his hand, looking lifeless and staring directly at me. I backed away and told him to stop. Jose did not speak. He started walking toward me like a zombie. I ran to my room, locked the door, and he began pounding violently on the wood with a blunt object, trying the doorknob. I yelled that I was calling the police. Suddenly, the pounding stopped, and I heard the connecting door slam. The police arrived, and we confronted Jose. He broke down, claiming he had a severe sleepwalking disorder caused by new medications. I decided not to press charges, but I barricaded the door with my dresser and moved out shortly after. I still do not believe his sleepwalking story. I believe he wanted to hurt me. Around that same time, my friends and I were going completely stir-crazy from the quarantine. To spice things up, we decided to go explore an old abandoned farmhouse just down the road from where we lived. It was my friends Luke, Kyle, and myself. Luke drove us there. It was only about a 10-minute drive down a winding hilly road. We pulled up to the overgrown, enclosed property where the empty farmhouse sat. Almost everyone in our town knew about this place, and knew that it had been abandoned for many years. Getting inside was incredibly easy. We simply broke a small window on the ground floor and climbed through. The inside of the house was freezing cold and covered in a thick layer of dust. When we turned on our flashlights, we could see dust particles floating everywhere in the beams of light. The most notable things about the house were the complete lack of furniture and the extremely creaky wooden floorboards. Even though we knew the place was abandoned, we still expected to find at least some old belongings left behind, but it seemed like local looters had already cleared the entire house out. We decided to split up to explore different sections of the ground floor. Within a minute, Kyle came tiptoeing back to us, his face pale in the flashlight beam. He whispered that he had heard someone or something moving in one of the other rooms. He pointed toward a dark hallway, refusing to go back over there. Luke and I quietly laughed, thinking he was either being paranoid or just trying to freak us out, but given how dark and silent the old farmhouse was, his claims did give me goosebumps. Luke and I still proceeded quietly toward the room Kyle had pointed at. It was almost impossible not to make a creaking sound on those rotting, terrible floorboards. We discovered that this part of the house contained a small hallway with a two-way staircase. One set of stairs went upward, while the other led down into the basement. But when I approached the basement staircase, my goosebumps returned. I realized that almost all of the stairs had completely collapsed. There was nothing left but a giant dark hole in the floor. As we stood over the edge, we heard a strange sound coming from the basement. It was a rhythmic, slow creaking noise that repeated every couple of seconds. Luke whispered to me, telling me to look down. I took a deep breath, knelt on the dirty floor, and pointed my flashlight down into the darkness. At first, I only saw the concrete basement floor and piles of rotted wood. But then I heard a quiet, raspy voice whisper from the darkness to my right. I quickly jerked my light to the side. There, sitting in a wooden rocking chair, was an old woman with long, messy gray hair. She was staring directly at me with a lifeless, malicious smile. I fell backward, dropped my flashlight, and screamed for my friends to run. We scrambled out of the window and ran to the car, where Kyle was already waiting. Luke hit the gas and we sped away into the night. We never went back there, and we still do not know how that old woman got down there with no stairs, or what she wanted from us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When I was 22 years old, I got a job in New York City. At the time, I was living over in New Jersey. There was absolutely no way I could do that daily commute. It was just too long, too expensive, and completely exhausting. So, moving closer to the city was not a luxury, it was an absolute necessity. The only problem was that I did not have a lot of money yet. I spent days scrolling through listings online, looking for anything I could afford. That was when I saw an ad on Craigslist for a bedroom in an apartment in the Hell's Kitchen area. The rent was incredibly low, so I jumped on it immediately. I took a ride to the city the very next day to view the apartment. When I arrived, the landlord gave me a quick tour of the place. He seemed a bit socially awkward, but to be honest, that did not really matter to me. I just wanted a cheap place to sleep. However, the place did come with a catch. The landlord explained that I would have a roommate. He told me the guy was a very quiet, keep-to-himself kind of person. He said this was actually a good thing because we would not get in each other's way. My roommate's name was supposed to be Bren. During the tour, the landlord knocked on Bren's bedroom door. He asked if Bren wanted to come out and say hello to the potential new roommate. There was no answer from inside the room. The landlord just smiled awkwardly and suggested that Bren might be taking an afternoon nap. So we moved on to the living room to talk about the details. I told him I was definitely interested in renting the room. I signed an application right then and there. The very next day, the landlord called me to offer me the room. I was thrilled, and I packed up my things to move in the following week. My dad helped me unload all of my furniture and boxes into my small bedroom. During all of this commotion, something stood out as a bit odd. This roommate, Bren, never once came out of his room to say hello or introduce himself. He was definitely home, though my dad and I could clearly hear him moving around inside his room while we were carrying heavy boxes down the hallway. I quickly came to the realization that this guy probably was not going to be very friendly, but I figured as long as he paid his rent and did not bother me, we could live together peacefully. Once we finished unloading the moving van, my dad said his goodbyes and left. I was officially moved into my new apartment, living on my own in the city. I sat down on my bed and started watching Netflix on my laptop to unwind. After a little while, I heard the door to Bren's room open and close. I thought this was finally my chance to go out, introduce myself, and break the ice. It was the first time he had left his room since I arrived. I got up from my bed, but before I could even reach my bedroom door, I heard the front door of the apartment slam shut. I stepped out into the living room, but there was nobody there. He had already left. I did not know what this guy's deal was, but surely he had to know that we would have to meet eventually. I went back to my room, made myself a bowl of ramen, and went to sleep. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of the front door closing again. I heard heavy footsteps on the creaky wood floor. They made their way down the hallway, right to the outside of my bedroom door, and then they stopped. I sat up in bed, my heart beating a little faster. I looked at the bottom of my door. The light from the hallway was creeping in, and I could clearly see the outlines of a pair of feet standing right outside. Why was he just standing there in the dark, staring at my door? I did not say anything. I just sat there in silence, waiting for him to walk away. My door did not have a lock, and I was honestly terrified that he was going to turn the knob and walk in. Thankfully, after what felt like an eternity, he walked away from my door and went back to his own room. I heard him shut his door. I tried to go back to sleep, but all night long I kept hearing loud thumps coming from his room. I had no idea what he could possibly be doing in there, but it was incredibly loud. I was tempted to go knock on his door and tell him to keep it down, but since I had not even met him yet, I decided to just deal with it. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, the apartment was completely silent. It seemed like Bren was already out, maybe at work. I spent most of that day out of the apartment, shopping for groceries and picking up basic necessities. When I got back, I dropped all of my shopping bags on the living room couch to rest. I cooked some dinner and watched a show on the couch. Bren still had not come home. Later in the evening, I decided to run down to the nearby 7-Eleven to get some toothpaste. When I walked back into the apartment, I noticed that Bren's door was cracked open and the light inside his room was turned on. I figured this was the perfect moment to finally say hello. I walked over to his door, knocked lightly twice, and pushed the door open. What I saw in that room shocked me, or to be more accurate, it was what I did not see. The room was completely empty. There was not a single piece of furniture in there, except for a single chair sitting in the far corner. It was the kind of plastic chair you would find in a high school classroom. My heart instantly started racing and my hands began to shake. I turned off the light, shut his door, and ran back into my own bedroom. I locked my door and sat down on my bed, suddenly getting a really bad headache from the stress. I took out my phone and decided to call the landlord to ask him what was going on. Why was my roommate living in an empty room with just a single chair? I dialed his number and put the phone to my ear. Suddenly, I heard a loud ringing sound coming from inside my own bedroom closet. My heart, which was already racing, felt like it dropped straight into my stomach. The phone rang twice, and then it suddenly went to voicemail. I stood up from my bed, ready to open the closet door, but then I froze. I realized that since the phone had only rung twice before stopping, it meant that whoever was in my closet had actively declined my call. In that terrifying second, I had a sick realization. The landlord was inside my closet. There was no roommate named Bren. It had been the landlord the entire time. I bolted into the bathroom, locked myself inside, and called the emergency line. The police arrived at the apartment shortly after and searched the entire place with me. Sure enough, they found the landlord hiding under my bed. It turns out he had slipped out of the closet and under the bed while I was locked in the bathroom. I tried to press charges for trespassing and get myself out of the lease agreement, but it turned out there was no actual lease. The man was not even the real landlord. He did not even own the apartment. I never found out how he had gotten the keys in the first place. I had my dad come back to the apartment the very next day with a truck to help me pack up all of my stuff and move back home to safety. I ended up finding another apartment the following week, but it was a massive hassle. I knew from the start that the so-called landlord gave off bad vibes, but I never could have imagined what he was actually doing. You think a fake roommate hiding in your bedroom is bad. Well, let's tell you about a guy named Ben. There was another young man who had just taken a job at a local chicken farm. It was hard, manual labor, and by the end of every shift, he was absolutely exhausted. Because he did not have a car at the time, he desperately needed to find a place to stay that was close to the farm. He spent hours searching online and eventually found an ad on Zillow for a shared apartment nearby. It was a perfect fit. The place was fully furnished, which meant he did not have to spend money on furniture. He moved in right away, only bringing a few bags of clothes and a small dresser. The spare bedroom had a bed ready for him, and he was happy to finally have a place to rest. The man who was renting out the room was named Ben. Ben was around 70 years old, and he was the only other person living in the house. Their rental agreement was very informal. It was a week-to-week arrangement with no written contract or lease. Every single week, the young man would pay Ben a set amount of cash. Ben was a very old-fashioned guy, and that old-fashioned attitude was reflected in the way he kept the house. The rent was incredibly cheap, and for someone who did not come from a wealthy background, this place was an absolute lifesaver. But then, things started to take a strange turn. One night, after a particularly long and exhausting shift at the chicken farm, the young man collapsed onto his bed and fell fast asleep. In the middle of the night, he was suddenly startled awake by the sound of his bedroom door slowly creaking open. The light from the hallway spilled into his dark room, casting a long shadow. Standing right there in the doorway was Ben. He had his hand resting on the doorknob, and in a deep, hoarse voice he said, "Stay out of the basement." He accused the young man of sneaking down there. The young man was completely taken aback. He defended himself, explaining that he had never even opened the basement door, let alone gone down there. Ben did not say another word. He just stared at him for a moment, slowly closed the door, and walked back downstairs. The young man lay there in the dark, his mind racing. He could not understand why Ben was acting so strange and paranoid, and it made him incredibly uncomfortable. The next afternoon was the young man's day off from work. He was sitting in his room when he heard Ben get into his old jalopy and drive down the road. The young man figured Ben was heading to the local store and would be gone for at least an hour. Once he was completely alone in the house, he found himself staring at the basement door. He knew exactly where the basement was, because he had seen Ben go down there several times before, but he had never gone down himself. Ben's creepy warning from the night before was eating away at him. He could not stop thinking about it. Why was Ben so determined to keep him out of the basement? The curiosity became too much to handle. He decided that since Ben was gone, he would take a quick peek downstairs just to see what was there. He walked over to the door, turned the knob, and opened it. It was pitch black down there. Under normal circumstances, he never would have gone down into a dark, creepy basement, but the mystery was too strong. He carefully started walking down the wooden steps, feeling his way along the wall. At the bottom of the stairs, he felt around and managed to find a light switch. He flipped it on. At first, the basement looked completely normal. It was just a typical dusty basement filled with old boxes and tools. But then he noticed a wooden door tucked away in the far corner of the room. He walked over to it and grabbed the handle. When he tried to pull it open, it would not budge. He looked closer and saw that someone had placed thick rubber concealer along the bottom of the door, sealing it shut. He had to use all of his strength to pull the door open, and the moment the seal broke, a horrific smell rushed out of the room. It was the putrid, overpowering smell of rotting flesh. It was so intense that he immediately began to gag and had to cover his mouth to keep from vomiting. He stepped inside the small dark room, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There were dark, dried bloodstains splattered across the concrete floor. In the corner of the room, there was a stack of heavy black garbage bags. The bags were stretched out, and they were clearly long enough to contain human bodies or body parts. He looked up and saw a small security camera mounted in the top right corner of the room. It was angled directly down at a wooden workbench in the center of the space. Realizing he was standing in the middle of a literal crime scene, he pulled out his phone, snapped a quick photo of the room, and ran back upstairs as fast as his legs could carry him. He ran into his bedroom, grabbed a large garbage bag, and started throwing his clothes inside. He knew he had to get out of that house immediately before Ben returned. But just as he was tying the top of the garbage bag, he heard the heavy front door of the house slam shut downstairs. Ben was back. The young man tried his best to stay calm. He walked out to the top of the stairs and called down to Ben, trying to sound as normal as possible. Ben did not answer. Instead, the young man heard him open the basement door and stomp heavily down the steps. Realizing this was his only chance to escape, the young man grabbed his bag, ran down the stairs, and bolted out the front door to his car. He got behind the wheel, started the car, and drove away without ever looking back. He drove 15 miles to his brother's farm. When he arrived, he showed his brother the photo of the sealed room. His brother looked at the image, turned pale, and told him he was an idiot for not calling the sheriff immediately. The young man called 911 and explained exactly what he had found. He gave them Ben's address and urged them to get a search warrant to check the basement before Ben had a chance to clean it up. He made sure to emphasize that he was just a temporary tenant who had stumbled upon the room by accident. A few hours later, a deputy from the sheriff's department came to the brothers' farm to get his identification and take a formal statement. The deputy then gave him some incredibly relieving news. They had gone to the house and arrested Ben. The old man had actually been in the process of clearing out the evidence from the basement when the deputies arrived, but he was not fast enough. The deputies did not go into detail about what exactly was inside those black garbage bags, and the young man knew they were not legally allowed to share that sensitive information. They thanked him for his help and left. The young man stayed at his brother's farm for a few weeks until he felt safe enough to find a new place to live. Sometimes, the creepy people we encounter in our lives are not older landlords with dark secrets in their basements. Sometimes, they are people our own age, the ones we are forced to live with in close quarters, like a college dorm room. Many people remember that exact feeling of walking into their dorm room for the very first time. You are excited, you are nervous, and you are hoping that the person you are sharing a room with will become a lifelong friend. When one young man walked into his dorm room, he was met by his new roommate, whom we will call John. John had very pale skin, short black hair, wore glasses, and spoke with a slightly feminine tone in his voice. He immediately struck the narrator as a quiet, hardcore gamer, which was not really the type of person he usually hung out with. When they shook hands, John gave him a completely limp, dead fish handshake, which was instantly off-putting. The narrator wanted to make some friends on his first day, so he left the room to go say hello to the other kids on the floor. He quickly hit it off with several of them. finding people he really vibed with. That first night involved a lot of unpacking, so the narrator decided to make an effort to get to know John. He asked him simple questions about his major and his hometown, but John only gave short, one-word answers that barely made sense. John went to bed incredibly early, turning off his desk lamp at 10 o'clock. Since nobody had classes the next morning, the narrator found this extremely odd. He just put his headphones in, watched some videos on his phone, and went to sleep around midnight. The next morning, the narrator went to the dining hall with some other guys from the floor. When he returned to the room, he noticed that his duffel bag had been moved. He opened it and noticed it felt much lighter, though he could not tell exactly what was missing. He straight up accused John of going through his bag, but John aggressively denied it in a sharp, defensive tone. Without any proof, the narrator could not do anything, but the trust was completely gone. The next night, a major thunderstorm rolled in. The narrator woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of thunder. Even with his eyes closed, he kept noticing constant flashing lights. He assumed it was just lightning from the storm and went back to sleep. The next morning, his backpack was wide open and moved. He decided to stay up the next night to catch John in the act. He pretended to sleep around 1 in the morning, keeping his eyes shut but his ears open. Soon he noticed those bright flashes of light again. He quickly turned around and caught John sitting upright in his bed, lowering his arms. It was not lightning. John was using his phone to take photos of him while he was sleeping. John stuttered nervously, claiming he just could not sleep. The next day, the narrator found the room empty and saw John's laptop sitting on his bed with the lid cracked open. He decided to snoop. The desktop was incredibly messy, but he found a hidden folder full of photos of him sleeping, as well as pictures of the insides of his bags. He took a video of the laptop screen as proof, deleted the photos, and reported John to the student housing office. They agreed to move him to a new room the next day. On his last night in the room, the narrator woke up to the sound of John's mattress squeaking. He heard a quiet, slow exhale of breath right above his face. John was standing directly over his bed in the pitch black. Terrified, the narrator stayed completely still, pretending to sleep until John finally got back in bed. First thing in the morning, he moved out, deeply relieved to get a normal, sane roommate. And finally, there is the story of a young woman who thought she was getting an amazing deal from a close family friend, only to end up sharing an apartment with a living nightmare. When she first moved out of her parents' house, her dad's friend Kathy offered to sublet a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment to her. Because she was tight on money, this was an absolute lifesaver. The only catch was that she would have to share the apartment with an older woman named Betty. Betty was 60 years old, and it felt a little strange having a roommate who could almost be her grandmother. However, the apartment was fully furnished, so she decided to make the best of it. The weirdness started on the very second night. While the young woman was sitting on the couch watching television, she suddenly felt like she was being watched. She looked over and saw Betty's head poking out from behind the hallway wall, staring at her with an intense, blank expression. Betty started making faint, strange moaning and groaning noises. When the young woman asked if she was okay, Betty just let out a low groan and disappeared back into the dark hallway. The young woman immediately called Kathy, but Kathy was surprised and said Betty seemed completely normal when they met. The next morning, the young woman ran into Betty cooking eggs in the kitchen. Betty smiled, said good morning, and acted completely normal. When asked about her bizarre behavior the night before, Betty looked genuinely confused and claimed she had absolutely no memory of it. A few nights later, the young woman was lying in bed when she heard a loud knock at her door. She muted her laptop and heard the same creepy moaning and groaning sounds from the hallway. The knocking went on for a full minute, but her door had no lock, so she just lay there in fear until Betty eventually walked away. The real nightmare happened a few nights later at 1:30 in the morning. The young woman was startled awake by a loud creak in the floorboards. She looked toward the foot of her bed and saw a dark figure standing there. She turned on her bedside lamp and gasped in pure horror. Betty was standing there, her long gray hair completely wild and disheveled, looking like a manic patient. But what terrified her the most was the large kitchen knife Betty was holding in her right hand. The young woman screamed in absolute terror and scrambled backward, pressing herself hard against the wooden headboard. Betty did not move or attack. She just stood there making those bizarre groaning sounds before slowly turning and walking out. As soon as she left, the young woman slammed her bedroom door and barricaded it with her heavy wooden dresser. She spent the next 6 hours sitting on her bed in absolute terror. The next morning, she contacted Kathy and demanded Betty's immediate eviction. Kathy came over to the apartment to speak to Betty directly, but explained to the young woman that the legal eviction process would take months. So it was best for her to pack up and move out immediately for her own safety. They eventually did some research and realized Betty was likely suffering from sundowning syndrome, which causes people with dementia to become confused, agitated, and aggressive late in the evening. It was a terrifying realization that in her confused state, Betty could have easily stabbed her to death. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We begin our journey in the year 2022 on a quiet Sunday evening along the coast of Northern California. The main subject of our first story was a young man living in the busy Bay Area, specifically in the city of Oakland. He had spent a pleasant weekend visiting his parents up in the remote coastal town of Eureka. If you have never driven on Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, you should know that it is one of the most stunning drives in the country during the daytime. You are surrounded by towering redwood trees on one side and dramatic cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean on the other. But at night, this beautiful stretch of road transforms into an absolute nightmare. It becomes a winding, isolated corridor with virtually no streetlights, no cellular service, and long stretches where you will not see another vehicle for miles. It has a very ominous, unsettling atmosphere when the sun goes down. Our driver left his parents' house in Eureka around 8 o'clock in the evening on that Sunday. In hindsight, he realized this was a very foolish decision. He really should have just stayed the night at his parents' place and made the drive back to Oakland on Monday morning. But he had an early shift at his job the next day and figured he would rather just push through and get the drive over with so he could sleep in his own bed. He packed his bags, said his goodbyes, and hit the dark highway, completely unaware of what was waiting for him. The first couple of hours of the drive were totally fine. The traffic was virtually non-existent, and the highway eventually narrowed down to a simple 2-lane road. This is how most of the rural sections of Highway 101 are once you travel north of the Bay Area. It is just a single lane in each direction, separated by a double yellow line, with thick dark forest pressing in close on both sides. He was making decent time, but somewhere around the small coastal town of Trinidad, the weather began to turn. A thick ocean fog started rolling in from the Pacific. Now, fog on this part of the California coast is not unusual at all, but this particular fog was different. Within a span of about 5 minutes, the weather went from perfectly clear visibility to an absolute whiteout. It was incredibly bad, worse than any fog he had ever experienced before. The narrator had to slow his car down to about 35 miles per hour just to keep his tires on the pavement. The smart thing to do would have been to pull off the road and wait for the fog to clear. But the problem was, there are very few safe places to stop on that stretch of Highway 101. The shoulders are narrow, and he was terrified of getting hit from behind by another driver. And honestly, he just wanted to get home. He figured if he just took it slow and kept his eyes glued to the road, he would be fine. But here is the thing about driving in fog that thick, and any experienced California driver will tell you this. It completely messes with your sense of space and time. You cannot see any familiar landmarks. You cannot tell how far you have actually traveled. You cannot see what is coming up ahead of you. It is deeply disorienting, especially when you are already tired from a long day of driving. After another half hour of crawling through the white mist, the narrator saw a figure standing off the side of the road. He used the word figure because that is genuinely what it looked like at first, just a dark, indistinct shape on the shoulder of the highway, about 50 feet ahead of his car. As he got closer, his headlights cut through the haze, and he could clearly see it was a person. Based on the height, it appeared to be a man, and he was just standing there on the gravel, facing directly toward the road. This was incredibly strange. The man was not walking along the shoulder, and he was not waving his arms to flag down a ride. He did not have a phone in his hands, and there was no broken down vehicle in sight. He was genuinely just standing there, perfectly still in the freezing cold fog. The narrator slowed his car down even more as he passed, genuinely worried that the man might suddenly step out into the path of his vehicle. But the man did not move a muscle. He did not even turn his head to watch the car go by, which was incredibly creepy. The narrator got a good, clear look at the man's face as he crawled past, and there was nothing about his physical appearance that struck him as unusual or threatening. He looked like an ordinary guy. The narrator tried to rationalize the situation as he drove away. He figured the man's car must have broken down somewhere further up the road, and he was just waiting for a tow truck. That would make sense. But the problem was, the narrator had not passed any other cars on the shoulder, and there was absolutely no logical reason for a person to be standing in that exact spot, facing that exact direction, in the middle of a blinding fog. There was nothing there but empty forest. He thought about turning his car around to ask if the man needed help, but a strong gut feeling told him that something about the whole situation was completely wrong. He decided it was not his problem, so he pushed down on the accelerator and kept driving. But then, about 10 minutes later, the narrator saw him again. He was not exaggerating when he recalled this. It was the exact same man. He had the same tall build, the same dark clothes, and the same stiff, unnatural stance on the shoulder of the road. The only difference was that this time, he was standing on the left side of the highway instead of the right. But everything else was identical. The narrator actually said, "What the hell," out loud to himself in the quiet cabin of his car. There was absolutely no way this man could have gotten ahead of him. The narrator was driving the only car on the highway, and there were no cross streets, no shortcuts, and no pedestrian paths through the thick redwood forest. The only possible explanation was that this was a completely different person who just happened to look exactly like the first guy and was standing in the exact same weird way. The narrator did not want to look at him as he passed, but he could not help himself. He had to confirm whether it was actually the same man, and after getting a close look, he was dead certain it was. But this time, the encounter was even more terrifying. As the car drew level with him, the man's head snapped to the side, and he locked eyes directly with the narrator. Seeing his head move so fast and feel those cold eyes on him was incredibly freaky, and the narrator instantly regretted making eye contact. He sped up, pushing his car to 45 miles per hour. He wanted to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was happening on that highway. But the fog got even worse after that. He could barely see the painted line in the middle of the road, so he had no choice but to slow back down. His brain was spinning, and he was having trouble thinking straight. He attributed this to a mix of exhaustion, the intense stress of driving in the whiteout, and the bizarre things he had just witnessed. He kept trying to rationalize it, but he could not. His train of thought was suddenly interrupted, though, because not 3 minutes later, his headlights exposed something else ahead. There was another person standing on the highway. But this time, he was not on the shoulder. He was standing directly in the middle of the driving lane, blocking the path. The narrator had no choice but to slam on his brakes and bring the car to a complete stop. This time, the figure was wearing a dark hood that completely covered his face, so the narrator could not see his features, but he had a sickening feeling in his stomach that it was the exact same man. The figure stood there, completely motionless in the high beams. The narrator was paralyzed with fear. They were at a complete standstill, and even though he could not see the man's eyes under the hood, he could feel him staring directly through the windshield. The narrator did not know what to do. In a desperate attempt to get the man to move, he flashed his brights at him a few times. He hoped the intense light would force the man to step aside, or at the very least react. But the figure did not flinch. Terrified, the narrator shifted his car into reverse. He looked in his rearview mirror to ensure the road was clear behind him, and what he saw nearly caused him to faint from terror. There was someone standing directly behind his car, creeping slowly toward his rear bumper. The narrator screamed in panic. He slammed the shifter back into drive. He was completely boxed in, but he refused to stay there and find out what these people wanted. He turned the steering wheel sharply to the right, crossing over into the opposite lane to bypass the hooded man blocking the road. The man did not move as the car surged forward. The narrator thought he had successfully escaped, but just as he got around the figure, something hit the back of his car. It was not a gentle tap. It was a violent, crushing impact. The entire rear end of his car jolted violently to the right, and the loud sound of metal crunching echoed through the cabin. The narrator struggled to maintain control of the steering wheel. He kept his foot pressed firmly on the gas, convinced he had just been hit by another car that had emerged from the fog. He checked his mirrors, expecting to see headlights or the wreckage of another vehicle, but there was nothing behind him. The highway was completely empty. The figures and whatever had hit him had vanished into the white mist. He did not stop to investigate. He drove as fast as he safely could through the blinding fog. By the time he reached the major highway interchange, the thick fog finally began to clear. The air became clear, the visibility returned to normal, and the narrator felt his rapid heartbeat begin to slow down. As the adrenaline subsided, his mind began to play tricks on him. He started to doubt his own senses. He had been driving for nearly 4 hours. He was incredibly sleep-deprived. He had been staring into a hypnotic wall of white fog for what felt like an eternity. He began to convince himself that the entire experience had been a vivid, stress-induced hallucination. It seemed like the only logical explanation. How could a man appear in multiple places? How could a car hit him and then instantly disappear? He decided that his tired brain had simply created the terrifying scenario out of exhaustion. He felt a sense of relief wash over him as he accepted this theory. He just wanted to get home, sleep, and forget about the weird night. But when he finally parked his car in his driveway in Oakland, he walked around to the back of his vehicle. His jaw dropped. The rear bumper was completely destroyed. There was a massive deep dent running almost the entire width of the bumper. The damage was extensive, meaning whatever had struck him had done so with immense force. He stood there in the quiet morning air, staring at the wrecked metal for several minutes. He examined the dent closely. There was absolutely no paint transfer. If he had been hit by another car, there would have been traces of the other vehicle's paint left behind. But the metal was clean, just severely crushed. The narrator realized with absolute certainty that he had not hallucinated the impact. The crash was real, and if the crash was real, then the terrifying figures he had seen in the fog were likely real as well. He ended up calling the local police department to file a report about the incident. He did not expect them to find the mysterious figures, but he wanted to get the information on record. Over the next 4 years, he spent countless hours analyzing that night, trying to make sense of the impossible sequence of events. He tried to convince himself that he had hallucinated the figures, and in his panicked attempt to escape, he had accidentally swerved and backed into a guardrail or a mile marker. But deep down, he knew that explanation did not fit. The physical sensation of the impact had occurred as he was driving forward, escaping the block. The damage was on the rear bumper, and there were no guardrails in that immediate area. The lingering mystery of what actually happened on that foggy stretch of Highway 101 continues to haunt him to this day. Now, let us transition to our second story, which took place much more recently. This event occurred during a recent college spring break, just a few weeks ago. The narrator of this story is a young man, a senior in college. Like many college students, he decided to return to his small hometown for the week-long holiday to relax and visit his family. But the problem with returning home is that his hometown is incredibly boring. It is one of those typical, quiet suburban developments that sits on the outskirts of a major city. While it is technically close to a metropolitan area, it has none of the benefits. There are no bars, no music venues, no coffee shops, and absolutely nothing to do within walking distance. For a college senior who is used to a busy social life and constant activity on campus, the quiet suburb felt like a total ghost town. To make matters worse, none of his old high school friends shared his spring break schedule. He still kept in touch with a small group of about 4 or 5 close friends from his high school days, but their breaks were at different times. Some of them had already completed their spring break earlier in March, while others were still stuck in classes and preparing for exams. This meant the narrator was facing a long, lonely week of absolute nothingness. Additionally, the narrator had recently made a personal decision to improve his health. He was actively trying to cut back on his consumption of nicotine and alcohol. He knew that spending a week with nothing to do in a boring town could easily lead to boredom-induced slipping. He did not want to ruin his progress, so he decided to channel all of his energy into physical fitness. He created a strict daily routine for himself. He would wake up early and lift weights in the morning, and then he would go for a long run in the afternoon. This kept him physically exhausted and prevented him from getting trapped in his own negative thoughts. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, he decided it was time for his daily run. He remembered a specific running route he used to do frequently when he was on the high school cross-country team. It was a perfect 3-mile loop that started and ended right at his parents' front door. The route was familiar and comforting. The first quarter mile took him through his quiet neighborhood streets. Then the path cut into a beautiful wooded trail that wound through a small patch of local forest. After about 2 miles in the trees, the trail would spit him back out onto the asphalt streets, just a block away from his house. The narrator had run this exact loop hundreds, if not thousands, of times during his high school years. The wooded section was always his favorite part of the run. Running on hard pavement is incredibly tough on your joints and knees, but the dirt path through the trees was soft and forgiving. It was also incredibly peaceful and quiet, which was exactly what he wanted to clear his mind. He stepped out of his house around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was not scheduled to set for another 2 hours, so he was not worried about running in the dark. But as soon as he crossed the threshold of the front door, he noticed something strange. The fog was incredibly thick. He had lived in this suburban town his entire life, and he had never seen fog like this before. It did not look like normal weather. It looked incredibly surreal, almost like a fake environment from a video game, or one of those stylized low-fidelity music videos online where an animated character studies in a quiet room. Everything beyond 30 or 40 feet was completely swallowed by a dense white haze. The narrator briefly considered calling off the run, but he quickly dismissed the thought. He was an experienced runner, and the trail through the woods was a simple, straight shot. There were no forks in the path, no confusing intersections, and no alternative routes. It was impossible to get lost. He had his digital Garmin watch strapped to his wrist to track his running pace and total distance. He pressed the start button, ran the first quarter mile through the neighborhood, and entered the dark tree line of the forest. Inside the woods, the fog was even more intense. The canopy of the trees blocked out the remaining daylight, making the trail feel dark and atmospheric. The visibility dropped to about 15 feet, but the narrator felt confident. The dirt path was clearly defined under his running shoes. For the first mile and a half, everything went perfectly. He maintained a steady, comfortable pace. He had to run slightly slower than his usual speed because of the limited visibility, but he was making good progress. He checked his watch at the 1 mile mark, and then again at the 1.5 mile mark. Everything seemed normal, but things started to go wrong when he reached the 2.5 mile mark. At this point in the running loop, the narrator knew he should be nearing the exit of the forest. The trail was supposed to curve gently to the left, head up a short, steep hill, and then open up onto the paved neighborhood street. He knew this physical layout like the back of his hand, but when he looked down at his Garmin watch and saw that he had covered 2.5 miles, he looked up and realized he was still deep in the dense woods. The trail was not curving, there was no hill. He was just surrounded by towering trees and thick fog. He tried to stay calm. He reasoned that his GPS watch must be malfunctioning. It was a 4-year-old watch, and the thick tree cover and heavy fog could easily interfere with the satellite signal. He assumed he was simply not as far along the trail as his watch claimed. He kept running, expecting to see the exit at any moment, but then his watch chimed, signaling that he had reached the 3 mile mark. The narrator stopped dead in his tracks. 3 miles was the exact length of the entire loop. At 3 miles, he should have been standing in his parents' driveway. Instead, he was standing in the absolute center of a silent fog-covered forest. The trees pressed in on him from all sides. The narrator was not a paranoid or superstitious person. He knew there had to be a logical explanation. He stood on the damp trail, catching his breath, and tried to analyze his situation. But he could not find a single rational answer. There was only one trail. He had not taken any wrong turns, because because there were no other paths to take. The only way he could have gotten lost was if he had physically walked off the path into the thick brush, which he certainly had not done. He looked down at his watch again. The display read 3.1 miles, and the distance counter was still actively ticking up, even though he was standing completely still. This confirmed his theory that the GPS was malfunctioning. He had to make a decision. He could either keep running forward and hope the trail eventually ended, or he could turn around and retrace his steps back to the entrance. Retracing his steps seemed like the safest option. If he ran back the way he came, he would eventually reach the neighborhood where he started. He turned around and began to jog back in the opposite direction. The fog was growing thicker by the second. He had to slow his pace to a crawl to avoid tripping over exposed tree roots or stepping off the edge of the path. The silence in the woods was absolute. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet. The forest was usually devoid of large animals, so hearing a loud noise was startling, but the sound itself was deeply disturbing. It was unlike anything the narrator had ever heard in his life. It was a deep guttural noise. The best way to describe it was a moan, but that was not entirely accurate. It was lower, more like a mechanical drone. The pitch fluctuated wildly. It would rise up in volume, then dip down low and then swell up again. It sounded remarkably like an emergency siren, but it had an undeniable, chilling human quality to it. It did not sound like someone crying out for help or someone in physical pain. It was a bizarre, rhythmic, wavering sound that felt completely unnatural. Terrified, the narrator began to run faster, but he was already exhausted from running over 4 miles. His muscles were sore, and his lungs were burning. The physical exertion combined with the overwhelming fear made him feel weak. The worst part was that the sound did not fade away. No matter how fast he ran, the strange droning noise stayed at the exact same distance behind him. Whoever or whatever was making that sound was matching his running speed perfectly. He glanced over his shoulder multiple times as he ran, but he could see nothing but a blank wall of white fog. The sound chased him through the dark woods for what felt like hours. It was the most terrifying experience of his young life. Finally, up ahead, the trees began to thin. The narrator burst out of the forest and onto the asphalt street of his neighborhood. He collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air and feeling nauseous from pure exhaustion. Even outside the safety of the woods, the fog was incredibly dense. The narrator slowly stood up, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and looked back toward the dark entrance of the trail. His heart stopped. Standing right in the middle of the dirt trail, just a few feet inside the tree line, was a massive, dark silhouette. It was not a normal human shape. The narrator is 6 feet 1 inch tall, and this figure towered over him. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. It was a solid black mass that seemed to absorb the light. The figure did not move toward him, nor did it retreat back into the forest. It just stood there, watching him. The narrator could feel an intense, hostile energy radiating from the shape. The only sign of life was a gentle, rhythmic swaying motion, as if the entity was rocking back and forth on its feet. The terrifying droning sound had finally stopped, but the narrator was not going to wait around. He turned his back on the forest and ran as fast as his legs could carry him all the way back to his house. That event occurred just a few weeks ago. The narrator is now back at his college campus, but he has not been able to find peace. The image of that massive black figure swaying in the fog and the memory of that horrible droning sound are burned into his mind. He told his parents about the encounter, and they tried to reassure him. They suggested that it was probably just a very tall local resident, or a malicious prankster trying to scare runners. But the narrator does not believe that explanation. No human could have made that bizarre, mechanical droning sound while running at a high speed through a dense forest to keep up with an experienced cross-country athlete. He knows there was something truly unnatural in those woods that night, and he knows he will never get the answers he seeks. Now let us transition to our third and final story. This third story takes us back 6 years to a late September weekend on the rugged coast of Washington State. The narrator and his close friend, Edwin, had been planning a kayaking trip to Willapa Bay for over 2 years. They finally managed to coordinate their schedules and lock in a weekend to make the trip happen. For those who do not know, Willapa Bay is a massive tidal estuary located on the southwest coast of Washington. It stretches for about 25 miles and is famous for its oyster farms, salt marshes, and the sprawling wildlife refuge that surrounds it. On a clear, sunny day, it is one of the most beautiful and peaceful places you can ever visit. But the weekend they chose was far from clear. It is important to understand that neither the narrator nor Edwin were beginners. They had both been paddling kayaks since they were young children. Edwin had actually spent several summers working as a professional kayaking guide during his college years. They were highly experienced watermen who understood safety protocols, navigation, and how to read the water. They were not easily frightened by normal natural phenomena. They launched their kayaks early Saturday morning from a public access point near the small community of Nakota. The coastal fog was incredibly thick that morning, but they were not overly concerned. Usually, the morning fog on the Washington coast burns off by mid-morning once the sun gets higher in the sky. They were fully prepared for the low visibility. They had a reliable GPS unit, a high-quality compass, and all the necessary safety gear. Their plan was simple. They would paddle out toward Long Island, spend some time observing the local bird populations, enjoy a packed lunch on one of the isolated sandbars, and then head back to the launch point before the afternoon tide shifted. The first hour of the paddle was quiet and peaceful. The thick fog muffled all the sounds of the coast, creating a serene, isolated atmosphere. It felt as if they were paddling through a giant cloud of cotton. They could only see about 40 feet in any direction, but they stayed close to one another and checked their compass headings every few minutes to stay on course. But around 9 o'clock in the morning, the peaceful silence was broken. The narrator heard a distinct splashing sound nearby. At first, he assumed the noise was coming from Edwin's kayak. They were paddling close together, with Edwin about 15 feet to his left. The narrator figured Edwin had simply adjusted his paddling stroke or hit a small wave, but when he looked over, he saw that Edwin's paddle was resting flat across the deck of his kayak. Edwin was not moving. Edwin looked at the narrator and asked if he had heard the splash. The narrator nodded his head in confirmation. They both stopped paddling and allowed their kayaks to drift silently in the calm water, straining their ears to listen. The sound came again. It was the unmistakable sound of wooden oars dipping into the water and pulling. As experienced boaters, they knew the difference between the sound of a kayak paddle and the sound of a rowboat's oars. A kayak paddle makes a quick slicing sound as it enters the water, but oars make a heavy rhythmic clanking sound as they turn in the metal oarlocks, followed by a deep hollow splash. The sound was coming from somewhere off to their right, and it was close. The narrator estimated it was no more than 100 feet away, hidden completely by the dense white fog. Edwin tried to downplay the situation. He suggested it was probably just another local boater or an oyster farmer checking on their equipment. This was a reasonable assumption. Willapa Bay is a working bay, and fishermen frequently use small boats to check crab pots or tend to the oyster beds. The fog was thick enough to hide the boat, and sound is known to travel over water in strange ways, making distant noises sound incredibly close. They waited for a minute, expecting the other boater to call out a greeting or emerge from the fog. In low visibility conditions, it is standard boating etiquette to make your presence known to avoid collisions, but the rhythmic rowing sound just continued at a steady, unchanging pace. Edwin cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted a loud hello into the fog. There was no response. The rowing sound did not pause, speed up, or slow down. Whoever was at the oars completely ignored Edwin's call. They resumed paddling, hoping they would either pass the other boat or that the boater would move away. But over the next 20 minutes, a creepy pattern emerged. The sound of the rowing stayed at the exact same distance from them. No matter how fast they paddled or what direction they turned, the steady, rhythmic clanking of the oars remained about 100 feet to their right. The perfect consistency of the rower's rhythm was almost hypnotic. It was incredibly difficult for a human to maintain such a precise, unchanging tempo for that long, without a single pause or variation. The narrator began to feel a deep sense of dread. They paddled in silence, the tension growing heavier with every stroke. At one point, they decided to alter their course and head east toward the shoreline. As they turned, a sudden pocket of thin air opened up in the fog. For a brief second, the narrator saw a small, dark wooden rowboat sitting in the calm water. He could clearly see the dark silhouette of a person sitting at the oars, facing away from them. But before he could call out, the fog rolled back in, and the boat disappeared from sight. The entire glimpse lasted no more than 3 seconds. The narrator asked Edwin if he had seen the boat, and Edwin confirmed that he had. At this point, the narrator had had enough. He was deeply uncomfortable and wanted to get off the water immediately. There was no obvious threat, but the silent, persistent tracking of the rowboat was incredibly sinister. He began to paddle rapidly toward the shore, and Edwin followed close behind. Navigating the bay in thick fog is incredibly difficult. There are shallow mudflats, shifting sandbars, and dangerous currents that can easily trap a kayak. They had a rough idea of where the shoreline was, but they did not know the exact terrain. The last thing they wanted was to run aground on a mudflat in the middle of the bay, while the mysterious rowboat was still out there. They paddled southeast as fast as they could, their muscles straining against the water. The sound of the oars followed them the entire way. Suddenly, without any warning, the fog began to lift. It did not clear away completely, but the visibility expanded to about 100 yards. The narrator immediately whipped his head to the right, searching the water where the rowing sound had been coming from just moments before. There was absolutely nothing there. The water was completely empty and still. He looked behind them, nothing. He scanned the water in every direction. The entire bay was completely deserted. He looked at Edwin and saw the absolute terror in his friend's eyes. The rowing sound had stopped the moment the fog thinned, and the boat had vanished into thin air. 5 minutes later, the dark shoreline came into view. They paddled straight for the beach, not caring about finding a proper landing spot. They hit the shallow water, and the narrator immediately leaped out of his kayak into the freezing, knee-deep water. He dragged his boat onto the sand, relieved to be on solid ground. They stood on the empty beach, catching their breath and staring out at the quiet bay. The fog was continuing to clear, but there were still no other boats in sight. Edwin walked a short distance up the beach to inspect the area, while the narrator secured the kayaks. Suddenly, Edwin called out to the narrator, his voice trembling. He told the narrator to come over and look at something. The narrator hurried over to his friend, and when he saw what Edwin was pointing at, his blood ran cold. There were fresh, wet, barefoot footprints in the sand. The prints emerged directly out of the deep water and led up onto the dry beach. They were incredibly fresh, and water was still actively pooling in the deep heel impressions. But these prints did not just lead onto the beach and stop. They walked up toward the tree line, turned, and followed the shoreline to the left before finally disappearing into the dense coastal forest. The narrator stared at the prints, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. Whoever made those footprints had to have come out of the water just moments before they landed. The narrator suggested following the prints in the opposite direction to see where they originated. Edwin thought he was crazy and demanded that they leave immediately, but the narrator was consumed by a desperate need for answers. After a brief argument, Edwin reluctantly agreed to accompany him. They followed the wet footprints down the beach for about 2 minutes, and then they saw it. About 50 yards down the shoreline, pulled up onto the sand at an angle, was a small, dark wooden rowboat. The wood was wet and almost black, and the heavy wooden oars were resting neatly inside the hull. It was the exact same boat they had seen in the fog. And now it was beached, empty, with a trail of wet footprints leading directly away from it. The narrator began to step toward the boat, but Edwin grabbed his arm with a tight grip. Edwin's face was pale, and he looked terrified. He told the narrator that they were leaving right now. He was not going to negotiate. The realization of what had occurred suddenly hit the narrator. The person in that rowboat had somehow managed to navigate through the thick fog faster than their modern kayaks. He had landed his boat on the beach, walked all the way down the shoreline to the exact spot where they were about to land, and then vanished into the dark woods just as they hit the sand. They had been watched. They turned and ran back to their kayaks, shoved them into the water, and paddled away from that beach as fast as they physically could. They did not look back. Over the past 6 years, the narrator has tried to find a logical explanation for that morning. The best theory is that they were the targets of an incredibly elaborate, well-planned practical joke. But that explanation makes no sense when you look at the physical facts. A heavy wooden rowboat is much slower and harder to maneuver than a modern sea kayak. How could a single rower outpace two experienced kayakers in thick fog, navigate perfectly to their exact landing spot, beach the boat, walk the sand, and hide in the woods before they even arrived? It was physically impossible. The mystery of Willapa Bay remains completely unsolved, a terrifying memory of a dark figure in the fog. When we look closely at these three bizarre encounters, a common thread begins to emerge. In all three cases, the victims were ordinary people going about their normal routines. One was driving home from a family visit. One was going for a daily fitness run. Two were enjoying a long-planned weekend outdoor excursion. They were not looking for trouble, and they were not under the influence of any mind-altering substances. But the key element in every single story is the presence of the thick, unnatural fog. In the world of true crime and paranormal investigations, anomalous weather events are often dismissed as simple coincidences. Skeptics will argue that fog simply creates a highly suggestive environment. It plays tricks on the eyes, it distorts sounds, it makes ordinary objects, like a tall tree or a distant fisherman, look like terrifying monsters or silent stalkers. But there is a major flaw in this skeptical argument. The flaw is the physical evidence left behind. In the case of the driver on Highway 101, his experience cannot be explained away as a mere trick of the light. He did not just see a figure and get scared. He experienced a massive physical impact that nearly threw his car off the road. The crunch of metal was loud and real, and when he got home, the physical evidence was right there on his vehicle. His bumper was crushed. The lack of paint transfer on his bumper is a crucial forensic detail. If he had hit a guardrail or another car, there would have been paint, wood, or concrete residue scraped into the metal. But there was nothing. It was as if his car had been struck by a massive solid force that left no trace of its own physical composition. In the case of the college senior running in the woods, his Garmin GPS watch provides another layer of objective, digital data. The watch recorded a distance of over 3 miles, while he was still trapped deep inside a small forest patch that is physically only half a mile wide. The GPS coordinates were scrambled, and the distance counter kept climbing even when he was standing completely still. This indicates a massive localized electromagnetic disturbance, something that is frequently reported in anomalous physical encounters, but rarely documented so clearly on consumer electronics. And then there is the physical matching of his speed. The entity in the woods did not just stand there. It ran alongside him, deep in the thick brush where no human could easily run, while maintaining a perfectly synchronized pace and emitting a highly disturbing, mechanical droning sound. And finally, in the case of Willapa Bay, the physical evidence of the wet footprints and the beached rowboat shatters any possibility of a collective hallucination. The narrator and Edwin both saw the footprints. They both saw the water pooling in the sand. They both found the physical rowboat. The timing of the prints proves that whoever was rowing that boat had intimate, impossible knowledge of where they would choose to land. They had run aground on a random stretch of wilderness beach, a decision they made on the fly in a state of panic. Yet the stalker had already landed, walked to that exact spot, and moved into the trees to watch them arrive. Who were these entities? Were they physical humans with malicious intent, using the cover of the fog to hunt and terrorize unsuspecting victims? Or were they something else entirely? Something that exists within the fog itself, using the weather anomaly to slip into our physical reality. If they were human stalkers, the level of coordination and physical capability they displayed is almost superhuman. The man on Highway 101 would have had to sprint miles through dense, dark redwood forests in the pitch black to appear ahead of a speeding car multiple times, then somehow orchestrate a massive rear-end collision without leaving any vehicular trace. The figure in the woods would have had to be a giant, standing over 7 feet tall, capable of navigating thick forest undergrowth at a full run in total silence save for a bizarre vocal siren. The rower in Willapa Bay would have had to possess a supernatural physical strength, rowing a heavy wooden boat through tidal currents faster than modern fiberglass kayaks, all while completely blind in the thick fog. The legal and investigative authorities have never been able to provide answers for these cases. When the Highway 101 driver contacted the police, they took down his statement but ultimately filed it away as an unresolved hit-and-run accident. There was no active investigation because there were no suspects, no license plates, and no video surveillance on that isolated stretch of road. The college runner never filed a formal police report, knowing that his story would sound completely insane to the local authorities. He knew they would simply dismiss it as a prank or a wild animal encounter, despite the impossible physical details. Edwin and the narrator of the Willapa Bay story chose to keep their experience to themselves for years, fearing that speaking out would ruin their professional reputations. The aftermath of these encounters is characterized by a lingering, quiet dread. The victims survived, but they were forever changed. They no longer look at a foggy day with a sense of cozy comfort. For them, the rolling white mist is a curtain that conceals a dark, incomprehensible danger. It is a reminder that there are boundaries in our world that can easily blur under the right atmospheric conditions. These stories leave us with many unanswered questions. What lies hidden in the deep, dark spaces of our coastal highways, our local forests, and our quiet bays? Is it possible that we share our world with forces we do not understand? Forces that wait for the perfect moment of isolation and low visibility to make themselves known? The next time you find yourself driving down a dark, empty highway late at night, or running along a quiet wooded trail, or paddling through the calm waters of an isolated estuary, pay close attention to the weather. If you see the fog start to roll in, thick and silent, swallowing the landscape around you, do not ignore your instincts. Slow down, stay alert, and whatever you do, do not look too closely into the white haze. You might just see someone standing there, waiting for you. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.